She was 30 years old, worth $4 billion, and she had never been wrong about anything in her life. No, until the morning she pointed at her janitor and told an entire hangar full of engineers, journalists, and military officials to laugh at him. "If you can fly that helicopter," Victoria Sterling said, loud enough for every camera in the room to catch it, "I'll marry you." The laughter was immediate. It was cruel. And it was the single most expensive mistake she would ever make. Because Evan Mercer picked up his mop, set it gently against the wall, and walked toward the cockpit. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Because the story you're about to hear is the kind that stays with you for days. We release new stories every week, stories about ordinary people who turn out to be anything but ordinary, and you do not want to miss a single one. And while you're at it, drop a like on this video and leave a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. No, I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. I'll be reading every single one. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Evan Mercer's alarm went off at 4:15 every morning, and he never once hit snooze. Because he was disciplined in any remarkable movie poster kind of way. It was simpler than that. If he didn't get up at 4:15, he'd still be in the shower when Sadie woke up, and then she'd wander in the kitchen, half asleep, confused about why the lights were off. And the whole morning would go sideways before it had even started. He'd learned that the hard way about 6 months after Claire died, on a Tuesday in February, when Sadie sat alone at the kitchen table for 20 minutes, waiting for someone to make her toast. He still thought about that Tuesday more than he probably should. 4:15. No snooze. He moved quietly through the apartment, a two-bedroom in a complex outside of Ridgefield, Virginia, that had a broken gate on the parking structure and a laundry room that smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how many times the super claimed to have cleaned it. He made coffee. He packed Sadie's lunch while the coffee brewed, usually turkey and cheese, because it was the only sandwich she'd eat without complaints. Sometimes M's with a small note folded into the bag. Nothing elaborate, just a small drawing of a dinosaur or a dog, something that might make her smile during second period. He left the lunch in the refrigerator at the front, where she could reach it. He wrote the morning routine on a sticky note and put it on the counter, same as he always did. Cereal is on the second shelf. OJ in the door, Mrs. Patton picks you up at 7:40. I'll be at the front of school at 3:00 on the dot. He signed it with a small crooked star because Sadie had told him once that she liked stars better than hearts, and he had never once deviated from that detail. He got in his truck and drove to Sterling Aeronautics in the dark. The Sterling campus sat on the western edge of a small industrial corridor, 30 minutes outside the city, a complex of low gray buildings arranged around 3 large hangars like satellites around a planet. Security waved Evan through the side gate at 5:20 every morning without looking up, which suited him just fine. He parked in the lot farthest from the main entrance, not because he was required to, but because he genuinely preferred it. Fewer people, queed or walk in. A few minutes of just the early morning air before the building swallowed him. He pulled on his gray Sterling Aeronautics custodial uniform, grabbed his cart from the maintenance bay, and started with the West Corridor bathrooms, the way he always did. He was invisible in the best possible sense. Engineers walked past him with their coffee cups and their conversations. Project managers crossed the hallway talking about pressure timelines and vendor specifications. Security personnel nodded at him occasionally. Nobody else made eye contact. He wasn't complaining about it. It was just a fact. Janitor at a defense aerospace company occupies a particular kind of social position. He is present everywhere and noticed nowhere. He cleans the bathroom that the vice president uses, mops the hallway outside the boardroom, replaces the paper towels in the executive break room. He hears fragments of every conversation, and he is, for all practical purposes, part of the furniture. Evan understood that dynamic completely and had made a deliberate peace with it. Nobody at Sterling Aeronautics understood because nobody had asked was why. His name was listed in the personnel file as Evan R. Mercer custodial staff hired 17 months ago. Special flags, standard background check, clean record, reliable attendance. The HR woman who'd hired him, a pleasant woman named Diane who always wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, had commented that he seemed overqualified, which was the word people used when they knew something didn't add up, but they couldn't quite identify what. Evan had told her he was looking for steady hours and a predictable schedule. That was true. It was also, like most things Evan said about himself, severely incomplete. What the personnel file didn't include was his prior career with the United States Army, specifically 7 years as a military helicopter pilot before a separate 3-year stretch as a lead flight evaluator and instructor pilot at Fort Rucker. What it didn't include was the aviation accident investigation course he'd taken at the Naval Postgraduate School, or the 17 different rotary wing aircraft he'd flown across 4 different deployment rotations. What it didn't include was the letter of commendation sitting in a manila envelope in a shoebox in the closet of his apartment, the one that used to make Claire cry a little when she read it, because she said it sounded like they were describing a stranger. That's because they're describing the pilot, Evan had told her. I'm the person who came home. She'd kissed his shoulder when he said that. He remembered the exact weight of it. He didn't think about the letter much anymore. He thought about the shoulder. He'd left the military 2 years after Claire's diagnosis. Because the Army made him, but because he made himself. The math had been simple and brutal. Claire needed someone who came home every single night. Sadie was 6 and starting to understand that something was wrong with her mother, and a 6-year-old needed a father who could explain it to her in real time, not over a satellite phone from a base in Germany. He'd given the Army everything he had for 11 years. He'd loved flying with a depth that was genuinely hard to explain to people who'd never done it, that particular combination of technical mastery and physical sensation, the way a helicopter responds to inputs through your hands and feet and the soles of your boots, the quetzes, the way the whole machine becomes an extension of your body at altitude. He'd loved it completely. And then he'd walked away from it because he stopped loving it. That was the part people misunderstood when he told them the few people he'd ever told. He'd walked away because loving something and choosing something are 2 different acts entirely. And he'd chosen Sadie. And he'd chosen the last 2 years of Claire's life. And he had never once regretted it. After Claire died, he'd needed a job that kept him on the ground, in the city, available by 3 o'clock every afternoon. Sterling Aeronautics had an opening in custodial services. The schedule was perfect, so there he was. 43 cents above minimum wage, a cart with a squeaky left wheel, and more aviation knowledge than anyone in the building realized was mopping their floors. The Falcon XR-8 had been a source of low-level tension at Sterling for at least 6 weeks before Evan started noticing it in the way one notices a change in a room's atmosphere, not through any specific thing, but through a collection of small things. The engineers who worked on the flight system had stopped eating lunch together. He'd noticed that because the break room on the east side of Hangar 2 had gone from being loud and argumentative at noon, the good kind of argument, the kind where people care about getting something right, to being almost quiet. No, people ate at their desks or in small separate groups, not making eye contact. Garrett Webb, the lead aerodynamicist, had been in the building past 8 o'clock 6 nights in the past 2 weeks. Evan knew this because he cleaned Garrett's office corridor last and could see the light under the door. 2 junior engineers he didn't know their names, but recognized their faces, had stopped mid-conversation when Evan squeaked around a corner near the avionics lab. He'd heard one word before they went quiet. Unstable. He hadn't said anything. He was the janitor, but he started paying more attention. He got close to the Falcon when he cleaned the hangar floor, which he did every Tuesday and Friday, a massive open space that smelled of hydraulic, fluid, and metal, and the particular clean chemical scent of composite materials. The XR-8 sat in the center of the main bay under the big overhead lights, a genuinely extraordinary piece of engineering to look at, aggressive in its geometry, the kind of aircraft that communicated speed and power even sitting still on its landing skids. He walked near it slowly on the far pass of his mop pattern, not approaching, just looking. The tail rotor assembly had a configuration he hadn't seen before. The blade pitch angle looked not wrong, exactly. Unusual. His brain filed it away the way it filed everything aviation-related, automatically without ceremony, like breathing. He didn't say anything about it to anyone. He was not asked. Victoria Sterling arrived at Sterling Aeronautics every morning at 7:45 in a black car that had a driver she did not appear to acknowledge. She was 30 years old and had inherited the company from her father at 26. And whatever anyone in the industry said about her, and they said a considerable number of things, many of them admiring, and many of them not, nobody argued with her results. Under her 4-year leadership, Sterling had grown its defense contracts by 60% and had beaten out 3 larger established manufacturers for the XR-8 program. She was, in every honest sense of the phrase, formidable. She was also, in a way that Evan observed from a suitable distance over 17 months, genuinely afraid, in any visible way. Victoria Sterling had mastered the performance of absolute certainty the way some people master an instrument through sheer repetition until it stopped being performance and became reflex. She walked into rooms like she already knew how every conversation would end. She interrupted people not out of rudeness, but out of a bone-deep anxiety about wasted time that had long since calcified into personality. She made decisions fast, because slow decisions felt to her like standing in traffic and hoping for the best. She was 30 years old and running a billion-dollar aerospace company, and she was, underneath all of it, genuinely scared that she wasn't enough. Evan could see that. He'd spent 11 years reading environments, cockpit environments, combat environments, the particular emotional weather of a crew that was holding it together under pressure. You either develop that kind of perception, or you didn't survive long enough to develop anything else. He'd never said a word about any of it. She was his employer. He was the janitor. The morning of the demonstration was a Thursday. Evan knew it was important because the whole campus had shifted 3 days beforehand, more cars in the lot, unfamiliar faces in the corridors. Men in suits who moved with the particular confidence of people who controlled budgets Evan could not have counted out loud without losing his place. Department of Defense personnel, procurement officials. He recognized the bearing before he recognized the rank insignia. He pushed his cart through Hangar 1 that morning at 6:45 before the crowd arrived, and noticed that the Falcon had been moved to the demonstration position near the main bay doors. It looked sharp under the overhead lights. 2 technicians were running a pre-check on the systems. A camera crew was setting up near the observation area to Evan's left. He mopped around the perimeter slowly, careful not to get in anyone's way. At 7:30, Garrett Webb walked in with 2 engineers, and Evan could read the conversation from 50 feet without hearing a word of it. Garrett's posture was that of a man trying to argue with someone who was not listening. One of the engineers kept gesturing at a tablet. The other one had his arms crossed and wasn't saying anything, which was sometimes the loudest position a person could take. Garrett finally stopped walking and said, "Loud enough to carry. I'm telling you, the rotor geometry isn't resolved. We've modeled it, and the mid-range transition is not predictable enough." A woman's voice cut him off. "The modeling was approved 3 weeks ago, Garrett. We are not pulling the aircraft the morning of a DoD review." Victoria Sterling had walked in behind them, without Evan noticing. She was in a charcoal blazer, her dark hair pulled back, a small earpiece in her left ear. She looked at Garrett the way a person looks at a problem they've already decided is someone else's. "Approved modeling isn't the same as the aircraft flies today," she said it without heat. She said it the way a person announces the weather. "Get Holt ready." Dale Holt was Sterling Aeronautics' senior test pilot, a man in his late 50s with a silver crew cut and the kind of weathered face that suggested he had never once been inside on a sunny day if he could help it. Evan had seen him around the campus occasionally. Holt always carried himself with the kind of calm that came from either exceptional competence or profound acceptance that some days went badly, possibly both. By 9:15, Holt was in his flight suit and standing beside the Falcon, and Evan was running his mop along the far wall of the hangar, staying well out of the way, but within earshot, because that was simply where his work was. He heard Holt and Victoria talking near the aircraft. "I flew the simulation last night," Holt said. His voice was even. "The transition at 85 to 95 knots is not clean. It's been logged and we're addressing it post-demonstration," Victoria said. "I'm not flying a test aircraft with an unresolved instability in front of." The way she said his name was a full stop. There was a silence. "I've got 23 years in rotary wing," Holt said quietly. I've put down one aircraft in a field in 2009, and I walked away because I was lucky, and I knew what I was doing. I will not put myself inside a cockpit that I don't trust with a room full of people watching and camera crews filming." He paused. "I'm not flying it." The silence that followed was the worst kind, the kind that had consequences inside it. Every engineer within earshot had gone still. Evan continued moving his mop in slow arcs, not looking up. Victoria said nothing for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Fine." She turned away from Holt and faced the room, and her jaw was set in the way of someone who has just lost something they needed and is deciding in real time how to hold themselves together in public. That was when she noticed Evan. He wasn't doing anything notable. He was just standing there with his mop near the equipment locker at the edge of the hangar floor, which was exactly where the work required him to be at that particular moment. The cart slightly to the left, the camera crew room to pass, and he was looking at the Falcon the way he'd always looked at aircraft, not with longing, not with anything dramatic, just with the quiet technical attention of someone whose mind naturally falls into that frequency. He didn't realize she was watching him until she spoke. He looked up. Victoria was walking toward him. Behind her, the assembled engineers and DoD representatives and camera people had all, somehow, noticed. "You were looking at my helicopter," she said. "I was mopping near your helicopter," Evan said carefully. A couple of people laughed. Small, polite, nervous laughs. Victoria looked at him, actually looked at him, which was not something she did with custodial staff, not unkindly, just by default the way everyone did, and something in her expression shifted into something sharper than amusement. The morning had gone badly. The test pilot had said no in front of a room full of people whose good opinion was worth more than Evan could calculate. She was embarrassed and angry, and she needed somewhere to put it. "What's your name?" she asked. "Mercer," he said. "Evan Mercer." "Evan Mercer." She glanced around at the room. The camera was still rolling. She either didn't care or she was leaning into it. "Do you think you can fly that helicopter?" The room went still in a different way. Someone started from the side. Victoria held up one hand without looking away from Evan. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the Falcon. Then back at her. "Miss Sterling," he said. "With respect, that's not a responsible question to ask." "You're right," she said, and her voice carried. "So let me make it irresponsible." She gestured at the Falcon with a sweep of her arm. "If you can fly that helicopter, Evan, I'll marry you." The hangar erupted. It was real laughter. The embarrassed, slightly shocked laughter of a room that couldn't quite believe what it had just heard, cameras catching all of it, men in suits grinning despite themselves, engineers looking at each other with widened eyes. Evan didn't laugh. He stood there and looked at the Falcon XR-8 for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes that nobody in the room was paying close enough attention to notice. He glanced at his watch, 7:58. Sadie's school day ended at 3. He had time. He leaned his mop against the equipment locker, dramatically. Note, slowly, with ceremony. He just set it down the way a man sets something down when he's done with it for the moment. He walked toward the cockpit. The laughter in the room died in stages. First, the people closest to him stopped. The ripple moved outward. As others noticed, he was still walking past the safety line, toward the aircraft, reaching up to check the maintenance access panel the way someone does when they already know what they're looking for. A technician started. Evan turned to the technician. His voice was calm and direct. "Has this aircraft been refueled in the last 4 hours?" The technician stared. "Has it?" Evan said. Yes, sir, full tanks." "Hydraulic pressure on both systems? Nominal battery bus?" "Hot standby." Evan nodded once. He put his foot on the step and climbed into the cockpit. The hangar was completely silent. He settled into the seat, and his hands moved to the controls before his brain had consciously directed them to. Was the thing about 10,000 hours of flight time. It didn't go anywhere. His body remembered before he did. His left hand found the collective. His right hand found the cyclic. His feet found the pedals with the ease of muscle memory, and that had been built over 7 years of doing it, day after day, until the helicopter stopped being a machine and became a language. He ran the military pre-start sequence from memory, the civilian sequence, the military sequence. Anybody watching who knew what they were looking at, and at least one person in that room did, because he could feel Holt watching from outside the cockpit would have recognized it immediately. He heard Holt's voice, somewhere behind him, and to the right. Son of Evan brought the engines up. He could feel the RPM climbing through his boots, through the seat, through the cyclic. The Falcon was a remarkably well-built aircraft. He could feel that even on the ground, the engineering quality in the response to his inputs. He watched the gauges settle and brought it to hover power. Get everyone back, he heard somebody say. Get them back! He lifted. The Falcon came off the deck with a steadiness that he attributed mostly to the aircraft and only partly to him, which was the honest way to think about it. A good pilot respects what the machine is doing as much as what he's doing. He held the hover at 6 feet, let the aircraft tell him what it wanted to do, felt the pedals, and felt the faint asymmetry in the tail response that his brain had already been turning over since the morning he'd first noticed the tail rotor configuration. Through the cockpit glass, he could see the hangar's open doors in front of him, the runway, beyond the Virginia sky, bright and clear. He looked at the people standing on the floor below. Victoria Sterling had both hands at her sides, and she was not moving. She was looking up at him, the way people looked at things they could not entirely explain. Evan brought the nose around, cleared the hangar doors, and moved out onto the taxiway. Yes, intervened. Then he pushed forward into translational flight, and he took Victoria Sterling's experimental helicopter out into the morning to find out what was wrong with it. The sky at 8,000 feet was the same sky it had always been. He'd forgotten, in 3 years on the ground, how much he'd missed it, the abstracted idea of it. The physical reality, the way the air moved differently, up here, the way sound changed, particular kind of focus that came over him when the ground was a long way down, and the only thing between him and it was the machine under his hands and his own competence. That focus was the clearest he ever felt. It was the one place where everything extra fell away and only what mattered remained. He leveled at 8,000 and let the Falcon accelerate. 60 knots. Clean. The aircraft was smooth and responsive, genuinely impressive at cruise parameters. 70, still clean. 80, he felt it at 83. A vibration in the cyclic that was distinct from the rotorcraft feedback, a frequency that shouldn't have been there. Faint but specific. A harmonic that didn't belong to the engine or the main rotor. He recognized it the way a person recognizes a wrong note in a piece of music they've played for years. He held the airspeed and worked through it, feeling where it got worse and where it modulated, tracking the way it changed when he adjusted his pedal input. 87 knots, the vibration peaked. He held it. Steady hands, steady feet, feeling every communication the aircraft made through the controls, cataloging all of it. The tail rotor geometry, the pitch angle he'd noticed on the ground, was producing exactly the kind of aerodynamic interference he'd suspected. At this speed range, the tail rotor's effective thrust was being disrupted by the wake geometry of the main rotor system, creating an oscillating asymmetry that the control system was trying to compensate for, but couldn't fully correct. He felt it clearly. He flew through it. He brought the airspeed back down on the other side, leveled at 60 knots, and turned back toward the Sterling campus. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. He was thinking on the way back about Sadie's lunch, which was in the refrigerator and which he'd packed with an extra pack of the peanut butter crackers she'd been eating obsessively for the past 3 weeks. He was thinking about whether Mrs. Patton would remember to remind her to take her allergy medication at noon. He was thinking about the kitchen table at home that he'd been meaning to refinish for 8 months and kept putting off because by the time Sadie was asleep, he was generally too tired to do it. He came back to the Sterling campus and set the Falcon down on the taxiway, with the touchdown so smooth it barely registered on the landing gear sensors. He brought the engines down and opened the cockpit. The crowd was completely silent. He climbed out of the aircraft, dropped to the tarmac, and stood there for a moment looking at the Falcon. Then he turned around. Every person in the hangar was looking at him. Victoria Sterling was standing 15 feet away. Her expression was not the expression of a person who had expected this moment. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was quiet enough that it wasn't performing for the room. She genuinely wanted to know. Evan told her. Not everything. Not the letter of commendation. Not the details of deployments. Not the years at Fort Rucker. The broad shape of it, military aviation. 7 years as a pilot, 3 years evaluating aircraft for the Army. When he finished, Victoria said, "Why didn't you say anything?" "About the helicopter." He looked at her for a moment. "About what specifically?" he said. "The vibration. The tail rotor. You obviously knew." "I had a theory," Evan said. "I'm not an engineer at this company, miss." "Sterling, the people who are engineers told you what they thought." He paused. "You knew there was a problem. Garrett told you. Holt told you. I'm not sure what my opinion was going to add." Victoria held his gaze. "Tell me now," she said. And Evan told her not about the tail rotor, though he covered that, but about the other thing he'd felt on the way back. The thing that hadn't fit the tail rotor profile. A second vibration, lower frequency brief, occurring specifically when he transitioned back through 74 knots on the descent. Distinct from the first. Not tail rotor origin, something else. He'd felt it for less than 3 seconds. In the silence that followed, Garrett Webb stepped forward. His face had gone slightly pale. "Which vibration range?" Garrett said. Evan described it. Garrett looked at the junior engineer beside him. He looked at the aircraft. "The harmonic damper on the main rotor head," Garrett said quietly, to no one in particular. "We passed it 3 weeks ago, but if it's compromised." "I'd check it," Evan said simply. He picked up his mop from where he'd left it against the equipment locker. "I need to finish the west corridor before my shift ends," he said. "I pick my daughter up at 3. He walked back to his cart, checked the time, and started toward the west corridor. Behind him he heard Garrett already on his radio, calling for a physical inspection of the harmonic damper assembly. He heard Victoria Sterling say to someone beside her something he didn't fully catch, just one phrase, spoken quietly, in a voice that had lost most of its armor. Nobody asked the janitor. He didn't turn around. He kept pushing his cart down the corridor, the left wheel squeaking the way it always did, the overhead fluorescence humming above him, the campus slowly coming alive with the particular urgent energy of people who had just understood that something mattered more than they'd thought. Evan Mercer moved through it all like water around stone. At 2:58, he was in the school pickup line, second car from the front, with the engine running and the radio on low. At 3:01, a 9-year-old girl with a backpack nearly as big as she was came out the front door of Riverdale Elementary, spotted his truck, and ran toward it without looking down at her feet, the way she'd done since she was small enough that Claire would always call out the door, "Watch the step, baby. Watch the step." Sadie yanked open the passenger door and threw herself into the seat. "You're not late," she said, slightly accusing, as though she'd been preparing for the possibility. "I told you 3, Evan said. She buckled her seatbelt and looked at him with the particular focus of a 9-year-old who can tell when something is different about a parent's face. "What happened?" she said. He glanced at her, then back at the road. "I flew today," he said. Sadie was quiet for a moment. "An airplane? Helicopter?" Another pause. "Was it good?" she asked. "Thought about 8,000 feet. He thought about his hands on the cyclic and the falcon moving through the morning sky like it had been waiting to be understood. He thought about the vibration he'd caught on the way back, the one nobody had noticed, the one that might have mattered enormously. He said it was good. Sadie nodded, apparently satisfied, and pulled out a library book from her backpack. She read for the rest of the drive home. Evan drove, and the left wheel on his mental cart squeaked quietly in the back of his mind, and he thought about a cracked harmonic damper, and whether Garrett had found what he suspected, and what it would mean if he had. But he didn't say any of that to Sadie. She was 9. She was reading. The afternoon light was coming in through the passenger window and catching the side of her face in a way that looked so much like Claire that he had to keep his eyes on the road. He kept his eyes on the road. The harmonic damper was cracked in 2 places. Garrett Webb stood in the maintenance bay at 4:17 that afternoon, still in his work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, looked at the disassembled component on the inspection table, the way a person looks at a car accident like he understood what he was seeing and couldn't quite make himself fully absorb it. The crack ran along the inner collar of the damper housing, not visible from the exterior, not something any pre-flight visual inspection would have caught. It required full disassembly and a dye-penetrant test to show up clearly, which was exactly the kind of inspection that had not been scheduled because the component had passed its last evaluation 3 weeks ago and was not due for reinspection for another 90 days. The junior engineer beside him, a 26-year-old named Marcus Teal, who had been with Sterling Aeronautics for 14 months, said nothing for a long time. Then he said very quietly, if Holt had taken it through the demonstration profile. Garrett said. Marcus stopped. Garrett picked up the component with gloved hands and turned it under the light. The crack was maybe 4 centimeters long in its primary run, branching into a hairline secondary fracture at the base. In isolation, it looked almost minor. In the context of a helicopter pushing through its full-speed range in front of a live audience with cameras and Defense Department officials watching, it was a catastrophic failure waiting for the right moment to introduce itself. He set the component back down. He pulled off his gloves. He stood there for a moment with his hands pressed flat on the inspection table, looking at the floor. He picked up his phone and called Victoria Sterling. She picked up on the second ring. Tell me, she said. Preamble. She'd been waiting for this call since the moment she'd watched Garrett sprint toward the maintenance bay 2 hours ago. Garrett told her. The silence on the other end of the line was the specific silence of someone processing information that they were not prepared for and cannot afford to show anyone how unprepared they actually are. How bad, Victoria said. Bad enough, Garrett said. If it had let go at demonstration speed, high vibration, load, full torque, transition through the unstable range, we're not talking about a landing incident, Victoria. We're talking about loss of aircraft, possibly loss of pilot. Silence. Shorter this time. Who knows, she said. Garrett paused. He hadn't expected the question to land that way, though he probably should have. The 3 people in this room, he said carefully. Evan Mercer, since he's the reason we were looking. Full report together tonight, Victoria said. I want to see it first thing tomorrow. And Garrett, nobody talks to the DoD representatives before I do. I need to get ahead of this. The call ended. Garrett put his phone down and looked at Marcus, who had clearly heard enough of the conversation to understand what had just been asked of them. Marcus had the expression of someone very young who has just realized that the professional world operates on a set of rules that nobody explained during the orientation. So what do we do? Marcus said. Garrett thought about that for a moment. We write the report, he said. Accurate. Complete. Everything. She said, I heard what she said. Garrett rolled his sleeves back down and buttoned the cuff. I'm telling you what we're going to do. You've got a signature on every inspection document for this aircraft, same as me. When this comes out, and it will come out, you want your name on a report that tells the truth. He picked up his clipboard. We write it accurate. She decides what she does with it. That's on her, not us. Nodded slowly. They started writing. Evan didn't hear any of this until the following morning, and he heard it the same way. He heard most things at Sterling Aeronautics indirectly, fragmentarily, through the particular acoustics of a building that was never quite as private as the people inside it believed. He arrived at 5:20 as usual. The security guard waved him through. He pulled on his uniform, grabbed his cart, and started with the East Corridor bathrooms because a pipe had run slow the day before and he wanted to check the floor drain before the morning foot traffic started. The maintenance bay was on the way. Through the narrow window beside the bay door, he could see that the inspection table still had equipment on it. The damper housing, a set of instruments, paperwork spread out. Someone had been there late or had been there early. He didn't stop. He noted it and kept moving because it wasn't his business and he had a drain to check. It was at 7:40 when he was running a clean mop down the executive corridor near the main conference room that he heard Victoria Sterling's voice through the partially closed door. He wasn't trying to listen. The nature of his work put him in proximity to conversations that weren't meant for him, and the professional response was to keep moving, which he always did. But he was moving slowly because the executive corridor floor was polished concrete that needed careful attention, and he heard enough in the time it took him to pass the door to understand that the meeting inside was not going well. He heard Victoria say, "The report goes to legal before it goes anywhere else." He heard a man's voice, not Garrett, someone he didn't recognize, say, "Victoria, the procurement committee is going to ask direct questions this afternoon. I'll answer them directly. After legal has reviewed the report." That's not how I understand how it works, Victoria said, and her voice had that quality it always had when she was 2 steps from losing her composure and working very hard not to. I built this company, Richard. Don't explain to me how it works. Evan kept moving. He didn't think much about it while he was working, which was how he operated. Always been able to compartmentalize with unusual efficiency, file things away for later processing, stay present with what was in front of him. What was in front of him was a corridor that needed mopping, and a slow drain in bathroom 3 and a broken fluorescent tube on the far end of the west wing that he'd put in a maintenance request for 2 days ago, and that had predictably not yet been addressed. He thought about it while he was eating lunch. He ate in the same place he always ate, the small employee break room, on the ground floor of the B building, which was used mostly by facilities and security staff, which meant it was generally quiet at noon and had a window that faced the parking lot and not much else. He ate the sandwich he'd made at 4:30 that morning, turkey, again, because he'd bought a large pack of turkey on Sunday and was committed to finishing it, and he thought about what he'd felt in the Falcon's controls at 74 knots on the descent. He thought about the damper housing. He thought about Dale Holt, stand beside the aircraft with 23 years of rotary wing experience, Victoria Sterling, that he didn't trust the cockpit. He thought about the DoD representatives who had been in that hangar, the ones with the particular posture of people who controlled acquisition budgets worth more than the GDP of small countries, and what it meant if this program lost their confidence. He was not by any stretch naive about what was happening. He'd spent 11 years inside military aviation programs. Yes, he'd intervened. He understood the institutional pressure that came with a demonstration that had already been scheduled, already been photographed, already been treated as a fait accompli in at least 3 procurement conversations. He understood what it felt like to be inside a program where the timeline had become the product, where the date of the demonstration had become more real than the aircraft itself. He'd seen it before. He finished his sandwich. He folded the wax paper and put it in the trash. He sat there for another minute looking out the window at the parking lot, where a black sedan with government plates had been sitting since 8 that morning. Then he went back to work. He was cleaning the hallway outside the avionics lab at 2:15 when Garrett Webb found him. Garrett came around the corner quickly, the way people moved when they'd been looking for someone and finally located them, and stopped when he saw Evan's cart. He was carrying a folder, and he looked like a man who had slept approximately 4 hours and was supplementing that with too much caffeine and a specific kind of professional anxiety that sits right behind the sternum's note. "Mercer," Garrett said. "You got a few minutes?" Evan looked at the hallway, then at his cart, then at Garrett. "I'm on shift until 3:30, he said. "This won't take long." Garrett glanced both directions down the corridor. "Somewhere private?" Evan thought about it. Supply room at the end of the hall. Lights on a timer. They went in. Evan hit the light switch. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and cardboard and the faintly chemical scent of the floor polishing compound he'd restocked 2 days ago. Garrett opened his folder and held out a printed page, a diagram of the main rotor head assembly with several components circled and annotated in red. "The damper was cracked," Garrett said. "You knew. How did you know?" Evan looked at the diagram. "I didn't know. I felt something that didn't belong to the tail rotor problem. Different frequency, different location in the airspeed range. I couldn't have told you. It was the damper specifically. I'm not a current engineer on this aircraft. I just knew it was a second problem. 74 knots on descent," Garrett said. 73-74. Briefly. Garrett nodded slowly. He looked at the diagram in his own hands as though he was asking it a question he hadn't been able to answer all night. "I've been running this program for 14 months. We've had 3 full system reviews. The damper passed all of them." He paused. "The crack is in the inner collar. You can't see it externally." Evans said, "You couldn't have seen it from the cockpit." "I didn't see it. I felt it." Garrett looked at him. 10,000 hours, Evans said simply. "Give or take." Garrett closed the folder. He put both hands on top of it and seemed to be deciding something. "She wants the report to go through legal first," Garrett said. "Before the DoD reps get it," I heard, Evans said. At Garrett's expression, "I was mopping the executive corridor this morning. I'm not invisible. but most people act like I am." Garrett almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face. "The legal review is going to take time. Time we probably don't have if the procurement committee is asking questions this afternoon." He looked at Evan steadily. "If someone with your background made a direct statement to the right person about what you felt in that aircraft," Evan said. Garrett blinked. "That's not my role," Evan said. "My name on a statement doesn't add weight to your report, Garrett. You're the chief aerodynamicist. You have 14 months of data. You have the physical evidence. Write it straight and let it stand." He paused. "She'll make the right call." Garrett looked at him with an expression that was not quite skepticism and not quite faith. "You really believe that?" Garrett said. Evan thought about it honestly. "I think she's scared," he said. "I think she's been scared since before I started working here, and she doesn't have anyone around her who's allowed to say so." He picked up the mop handle. "She made the wrong call on the demonstration timeline. She knows that now. People who know they made a wrong call when they finally let themselves look at it straight usually do the right thing." "Usually. Usually is not the same as definitely," Garrett said. Evan agreed. "It's not." Garrett took his folder and left. Evan mopped the rest of the hallway. At 2:56, he clocked out, got in his truck, and drove to Riverdale Elementary. The video went everywhere that night. Evan didn't know about it until Sadie was already in bed, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his phone showing him 17 missed calls and a text from a number he didn't recognize that just said, "Please call me back. This is important. I work for a media outlet," and which he read halfway through and then set face down on the table. He opened his news browser instead. It took him about 40 seconds to find it. Someone in the hangar had been filming when Victoria made her challenge. The clip was 49 seconds long. It started with her saying, "If you can fly that helicopter, Evan, I'll marry you." The laughter. The room. Evan setting down the mop, and then it cut to shaky, wide-angle footage of the Falcon lifting off from the taxiway in the hands of the man who was supposed to be cleaning the floor. The clip ended before he landed. It didn't need to. The landing wasn't the point. The clip had 4 million views. By the time he'd set his phone back down, it probably had more. He sat at the kitchen table for a while with his coffee going cold and looked at the opposite wall, where Sadie had tipped up a drawing she'd made at school, a dog with an implausibly large head and the words "This is Barkley" written underneath in her specific handwriting that was neat on the first letter and progressively less neat as she got toward the end of the word. Claire had been the same way. She always started things carefully and got excited and let the careful go. His phone buzzed again. He didn't look at it. He thought about what was coming. He'd been in situations before where his name attracted attention after a successful recovery in a combat zone. No, after a safety report he'd written got circulated through channels he hadn't expected. He knew what it felt like when an institution noticed you, and he knew that it didn't always feel like what people imagined it would feel like. There was a version of what was happening that could be genuinely fine. There was also a version where it complicated things considerably, and he didn't yet know which version this was going to be. What he was most aware of, sitting at that table, was that Sadie was 9 years old and asleep in the next room, and that she had no idea her father was currently in a 49-second clip that 4 million people had watched. Nanit Tam, and that by the time she went to school tomorrow, chance at least one other parent would say something to her that she was not prepared for. He went to her bedroom door and opened it a few inches. She was asleep on her side with her arm around a stuffed elephant named Gerald that she'd had since she was 3. Her backpack was in the corner where she always dropped it, not hung up, never hung up, despite 3 years of gentle, consistent reminders. Her library book was open face down on the floor beside the bed, which was going to crack the spine, which he'd told her about 14 times. He didn't go in and close it. He just looked at her for a moment. He went back to the kitchen table and picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't called in almost 3 years. Tom Bird picked up on the 4th ring with the sound of a television being muted in the background and the specific tone of someone who had been watching the clock all evening waiting for this exact call. Tom had been Evan's evaluating officer at Fort Rucker before Evan left the Army. He was now a retired colonel living outside of Nashville. With a large dog, he sent pictures of unprompted and an opinion about everything that he delivered without apology. He was also one of exactly 4 people in the world who knew the full shape of Evan Mercer's career, and one of exactly 2 people Evan would have called on a night like this one. "I've been watching the news," Tom said, before Evan could say anything. "I figured," Evan said. "You want to tell me how a man with your flight hours ends up mopping floors at an aerospace company?" "I've been mopping floors at that aerospace company for 17 months, Evan said. "You didn't know about it until about 6 hours ago." "That's fair," Tom said. "How's Sadie?" "Good, she's asleep. She doesn't know yet. She's going to know by tomorrow morning." "Yes," Evan said. There was a comfortable pause. That was one of the things about Tom. He could sit in a silence without needing to fill it, which was rarer than it should have been. "You found a cracked damper," Tom said. "Garrett Webb's team found it. I pointed them in the right direction." "Don't be modest, Evan. I've known you too long." Tom paused. "I'm going to get some calls tomorrow. People I still know. Some of them are going to ask me about you, and I want to know what you want me to say." Evan looked at the kitchen table, at the drawer in the corner that he hadn't opened in 3 years because it had Claire's reading glasses in it and a small notebook with her handwriting. And he was not yet ready for that to be a normal Tuesday, just opening a drawer. "Say I'm a single father," Evan said. "That I'm doing what I need to do for my daughter." "That's accurate." "And the aviation?" "Tell them I miss it," Evan said. "That's also accurate." Tom was quiet for a moment. "There are going to be opportunities coming out of this. Real ones. The kind you walked away from." "I didn't walk away from aviation," Evan said. "I walked toward Sadie." "That's not mutually exclusive," Tom said. "It hasn't been mutually exclusive for a while now." "She's 9, Evan. She's in school. You don't have to," Evan said. He said it in the way that meant the conversation was getting close to something he wasn't ready to walk into yet. Tom knew that tone well enough to respect it. "Get some sleep," Tom said. "Things will be clearer in the morning." "They usually aren't," Evan said. Tom agreed. "But you usually handle them anyway." Things were not clearer in the morning, were substantially louder. There were 2 news vans in the Sterling Aeronautics parking lot when Evan pulled in at 5:20. The security guard at the side gate, who had been waving him through without looking up for 17 months, looked up today. "Mr. Mercer," the guard said, with an expression that suggested he wasn't entirely sure what the correct protocol was for this particular situation. "Morning," Evan said. He drove through, parked in his usual spot at the far end of the lot, and pulled on his uniform. Inside, the campus felt different. The particular hum of an institution that has been the subject of outside attention, overnight the slightly elevated energy, the groups of 2 and 3 people talking in corridors and going quiet when a door opened, the email chains that had clearly been active since midnight. He wheeled his cart to the east corridor and started his usual pattern. By 6:30, 2 different colleagues he'd barely spoken to in 17 months had found reasons to work in the same area he was cleaning. One of them, a logistics coordinator named Paul, who had never once said more than good morning to him, managed to position himself near the supply closet and then say, with labored casualness, "Crazy stuff yesterday, huh?" Evan said and kept mopping. Paul waited for more. It didn't come. At 7:15, he got a message on his phone from a number that turned out to be Victoria Sterling's assistant. "Miss, Sterling would like to meet with you at 8 o'clock this morning, if you're available." He thought about that for a moment. He typed back, "I'm available." He showed up at her office at 8 on the dot, still in his work uniform, because he hadn't brought anything else, and because he also, on some level, thought it was important not to show up in anything else. He knocked on the open door. Victoria was at her desk, which was covered in a specific kind of organized chaos, multiple screens, printed documents, a coffee cup that looked like it had been refilled at least 3 times already, based on the ring stains on the desk calendar beneath it. She was on the phone when he walked in, and she held up one finger, the universal gesture for 1 more minute, and finished the call with a few words that conveyed, efficiently, that she was ending the conversation and would follow up later. She set the phone down and looked at Evan. In the daylight of her office, without the performance pressure of the hangar and the cameras in the audience, she looked younger and more tired than he'd ever noticed her looking. She had the particular appearance of someone who had not slept more than 4 hours and was managing it purely through will and caffeine and the inability to afford an alternative. "Sit down," she said. Evan sat. "I owe you an apology," she said. He said he'd intervened. She said it the way people say difficult things, when they've rehearsed them enough to get past the discomfort, but not quite enough to make them feel natural. There was no performance in it. It landed as genuine, which was probably the most valuable kind. "You don't have to," he started. "I mocked you in front of a room full of people and a camera crew," she said. It was cruel. It was also stupid, which I hate almost as much. She held his eyes. "I'm sorry," Evan nodded once. "Okay," he said. She seemed to register that he wasn't going to make it easier or harder than that, and something in her posture shifted slightly, the way people shift when they've been braced for a reaction. And the actual reaction is simply acceptance. "The damper report," she said. "Garrett gave it to me this morning. Complete. Unredacted." She paused. "I'm presenting it to the DoD representatives at 10 o'clock. Full disclosure. The demonstration is postponed until the rotor geometry is corrected and a complete independent inspection is completed." Evan said nothing. "It's going to cost us," she said. "The timeline, the contract terms, possibly the relationship with the procurement committee. Know yet how far the damage goes." She looked at him levelly. "I'm also going to acknowledge on the record that the safety culture at this company created an environment where engineers were afraid to push back on my decisions. That's going to be in the statement." "That's the right call," Evan said. "It's the only call," Victoria said, with a slight edge that wasn't directed at him. "I just needed to get there." She paused. "Garrett told me you suggested he write the report accurately and let it stand. You believed I'd do the right thing." Evan looked at her. "I said usually," he said. For the first time in either of their recollections of one another, Victoria Sterling laughed. It was little surprised, not polished at all. The laugh of a person who hadn't expected to laugh and hadn't had a reason to in quite a while. "Fair enough," she said. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was the posture of someone who had made all the hard decisions and now had to live in the space that those decisions had opened up. "I want to offer you a position," she said. "Aviation safety and flight evaluation. A favor. Not because of the video." She looked at him directly. "Because you flew an unfamiliar experimental aircraft, identified a structural fault through control feedback alone, and landed without incident. Those are skills that don't exist at this company, and that this company clearly needs." Evan was quiet for a moment. "What does the position look like?" he said. "Senior consultant to start, with a path to full staff if that's what you want. I'm not going to insult you. With a number, tell me what you need." "It's not about a number," Evan said. Victoria looked at him. "My daughter is 9 years old," he said. "I pick her up at 3 o'clock. Every day. I don't miss school events. I don't take calls during her dinner if I can help it. I don't travel overnight without 48 hours notice minimum, and if she gets sick, I leave." He paused. "That's not negotiable." Victoria held his gaze for a long moment. "Okay," she said. "You should think about it before you." I said, "Okay," she said. It wasn't impatient, it was direct. "I'll have HR build the position around those parameters. If something doesn't work, we talk about it like adults and figure it out." Evan looked at her. She looked back. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking," she said. He stood up. He picked up his cap from his knee. "I've got the West Wing bathrooms before 9, he said. Victoria looked at him for a moment. "You're still going to—" "I'm on shift until 3:30, Evan said. "I don't leave things half done." He walked back out in the corridor and returned to his cart, and the left wheel squeaked the way it always did, and the executive floor hummed with the specific anxious energy of an institution on the edge of accountability. And Evan Mercer pushed his cart toward the West Wing, in the gray uniform that nobody noticed, through the building that was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to notice. The DoD meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, and Victoria Sterling did not flinch once. Evan knew this, not because he was present, he was at the second-floor lab corridor during most of it, but because Garrett Webb found him afterward at 11:55, looking like a man who had just watched someone walk through fire and come out the other side with their clothes still on. Garrett leaned against the wall near Evan's cart and crossed his arms and said, "She didn't blame anyone else." Once, Evan kept wringing out the mop. She put the full report on the table, Garrett said. Damper findings, rotor geometry analysis, the safety culture assessment. All of it. She told them the timeline pressure came from her, that the engineers flagged concerns that didn't get adequate response, and that the demonstration is postponed pending independent inspection. He paused. Colonel Marsh, he's the senior procurement officer. He asked her directly she was aware of the instability reports before the demonstration date was set. She said yes. How did that land, Evan said. About how you'd expect. Garrett exhaled through his nose. They're not walking away from the program. The Falcon is still the best platform they've evaluated for the requirements. But they want independent oversight on the next flight evaluation, and they want a formal safety protocol review before the program moves forward. He looked at Evan sideways. They also asked about you. Evan stopped mopping. Colonel Marsh recognized your name, Garrett said. Apparently you wrote a safety evaluation report about 8 years ago that got circulated through some channels. He said, and I'm quoting here, that it was one of the most thorough flight dynamics analyses he'd ever read from an active-duty pilot. Evan was quiet for a moment. He remembered the report. It had been about a tail rotor failure mode in a specific combat configuration, written after an incident in a forward operating environment that had almost gone very badly, and hadn't, only because the pilot involved had exceptional instincts and a small amount of luck. He'd spent 3 weeks on it. He hadn't thought about it in years. What did she tell them? Evan said. That you're currently evaluating a position at Sterling. Garrett paused. I think she was being optimistic about the timeline on that. I told her I'd think about it, Evan said. She tends to interpret that as yes, Garrett said. Fair warning. Evan picked up his mop again. What are you going to do? Garrett said. Evan looked at the corridor ahead of him, still half unmopped, the overhead fluorescents making the wet floor sections shine. Right now I'm going to finish this hallway, he said. I'm going to pick up my daughter. Sadie already knew by the time he got to the school. He could tell, 'cause she came out the front door at 3:02 with a different expression than usual, not upset exactly. More like she was carrying something carefully. Children carry things they're not sure they're allowed to put down yet. She got in the truck and buckled her seatbelt and didn't immediately pull out her library book, which was notable. They drove 2 blocks before she said anything. Emma's mom showed Emma the video, Sadie said. Okay, Evan said. Emma told me about it at lunch. She paused. She said you flew a helicopter. I did. She said it was a really expensive helicopter. It was. Sadie looked out the passenger window at the passing street. A long pause. Were you scared? She said. Evan thought about that honestly, because he could always tell when he was giving her a diplomatic answer instead of a real one, and she was 9, and she deserved real ones. A little, he said. The helicopter had some problems. I wasn't sure exactly how bad they were until I was flying it. But you landed it okay. Yeah, so you knew how to fix it while you were flying it? I knew how to manage it, Evan said. That's a little different from fixing it. Sadie seemed to consider this distinction with appropriate seriousness. They stopped at a red light. A pigeon on the sidewalk was investigating an abandoned fast food bag with dedicated professional focus. Emma said the lady who owns the company said she'd marry you, Sadie said. Evan kept his eyes on the pigeon. She was making a joke, he said. A weird joke, Sadie said. Yes, Evan agreed, a weird joke. Did it make you mad? He thought about that too, not exactly. It was she was having a bad morning and she made a mistake. People do that. Sadie turned to look at him. She had Claire's habit of looking directly at people when she was trying to understand them. No averting. Just a direct, calm assessment that could be slightly unnerving. Are you going to work there different now? She said. Not be the cleaner anymore? I don't know yet, Evans said. She offered me a different job. I'm thinking about it. Would you still pick me up at 3? That's the only way I'd take it, Evans said. The light changed. They drove. After a moment, Sadie pulled her library book out of her backpack, which meant the important part of the conversation was done, and she was satisfied with the answers she'd gotten. The spine on that book is cracked, Evans said. I know, she said, without looking up. How does that happen? It fell. It fell face down open on your floor. Falling is falling, Sadie said, with the specific breezy confidence of a 9-year-old who knows she's lost this particular argument and has decided not to acknowledge that fact. Evan didn't push it. He drove, and she read, and outside the truck windows, the afternoon was doing what Virginia afternoons did in that particular season, going gold and long-shadowed in a way that made everything look like the establishing shot of something. The calls started that evening and didn't stop for a week. The media calls he screened and ignored, with the exception of one reporter from an aviation trade publication who left a voicemail that was more technically literate than the others, and whom Evan called back and spoke to for 12 minutes before deciding he'd said, and ending the conversation, politely but firmly. He didn't watch the segments that ran about him. He knew they existed because Tom sent him a text that said simply, CNN did a segment. You looked unimpressed. It was accurate. He didn't watch it. The calls that he did take were more complicated. 3 people he'd served with reached out, 2 pilots he'd instructed at Fort Rucker, and a former squadron colleague named Harris, who was now at the Pentagon in an acquisition oversight role, which had not been his trajectory when Evan had known him, and was mildly surprising. Harris left a voicemail that was professional on the surface, and underneath carries the specific texture of someone who wanted to have a conversation that hadn't been requested yet. Evan called him back on a Thursday evening while Sadie was at Mrs. Patton's for a 2-hour after-school activity, a craft thing involving what Sadie had described as a lot of glitter and not enough structure, which Evan had interpreted as meaning she loved it. Harris picked up immediately. Mercer, he said. I wasn't sure you'd call back. I wasn't sure either, Evan said honestly. Harris laughed. It was genuine. They'd been honest with each other. That people who'd served together could sometimes be honest with each other without the social scaffolding that usually required. Fair. Look, I'm going to be direct because that's easier for both of us. What you did at Sterling, the flight, the damper that's being talked about in some rooms that aren't usually interested in civilian aerospace companies. I figured, Evan said. There's interest in bringing you back into a formal capacity. Advisory level flight evaluation, possibly program oversight on some next-gen rotary projects that I can't get into specifics on over the phone, but that you'd find interesting. Harris paused. The terms would be considerably better than mopping floors. The mopping floors thing is getting a lot of mileage, Evan said. It's a memorable detail, Harris said. People like a story. People like a story that's simpler than the actual situation, Evan said. The actual situation is that I needed a job with a specific schedule, and this was the job that fit it. That's not a dramatic origin story. It's just logistics. Harris was quiet for a moment. How's Sadie? Good, Evan said. She's 9. She has strong opinions about library book spines and sandwich fillings. And the schedule thing? Still the schedule thing, Evan said. That complicates it. It doesn't have to, Harris said. That's actually what I'm calling to tell you. There's a structure being against these civilian contract basis, project-specific, with significant schedule flexibility built in. It's not the same as active duty. You'd have control over your commitments in a way you didn't have before. He paused. I'm not going to push you. I just want you to know the door is genuinely open. Evan looked at the kitchen table in front of him. The old wood grain that he'd been meaning to refinish for 8 months. Claire had found that table at an estate sale on a Saturday morning when Sadie was 4, loaded it into a rented van with the help of a neighbor, and declared it exactly right for a kitchen because it was solid and imperfect and had obviously been used. She'd been right. It was obviously the right table. He'd been living at it every evening since. Send me what you can in writing, Evan said. I'll look at it. That's more than I expected, Harris said. Don't oversell it, Evan said. Looking isn't deciding. Understood, Harris said. Give Sadie my best. She doesn't know you, Evan said. Harris said. Give it to her anyway. Sterling Aeronautics, in the days following the DoD meeting, went through the specific institutional convulsion of an organization that has been forced to look at itself honestly and doesn't entirely like what it sees. Evan watched it happen from his particular vantage point. The floor level, the corridors, the break rooms, the spaces between spaces that an institution generates and then forgets about. The first visible change was that the weekly all-hands, which had previously been a 40-minute event in which Victoria delivered updates and nobody asked difficult questions, became an hour and 20 minutes of what Evan, passing the open conference room door, could hear was an actual conversation. People were talking. People were being allowed to finish their sentences. He didn't stop to listen, but he heard enough to register the difference. The second change was that 3 previously filed safety concern reports, 2 from the avionics team and 1 from the structural analysis group, all logged in the formal system, but never formally addressed, were pulled, reviewed, and responded to with written memos from senior engineering staff. Garrett Webb told him this when they crossed paths near the coffee station on the ground floor. She asked me to audit the concern log going back 2 years, Garrett said. Anything unresolved gets a response by end of week. He poured his coffee. There were 11 of them. That's not a lot, Evan said. For a company this size in a 14-month period. Garrett looked at him. That's actually a small number, which means either the engineers were very confident or they'd learned not to bother filing. They both knew which one it was. The third change was subtler, and Evan noticed it not in any single event, but across a week of ordinary interactions. People looked at each other differently in the corridors. Warmly, necessarily the institutional culture didn't reshape itself in a week, and wouldn't in a month either, but more directly. The specific kind of avoidance that a fear-based workplace generates, where everyone is slightly angled away from everyone else in case proximity implicates them in the next failure, had eased a few degrees. Gone. Eased. Evan didn't say anything about any of it to anyone. He noted it the way he noted everything, quietly, accurately, without drama. On a Tuesday afternoon, 9 days after the Falcon flight, he was finishing the east hangar floor when Victoria Sterling walked in alone. She did this. Occasionally, he'd learned came to the hangars when the day's meetings were done, usually in the early afternoon before the building thinned out, and just stood near the aircraft. He'd seen her do it twice before without registering what it meant. He registered it now. She came here to think. The hangar was the realest place in the building. Everything else was paper and meetings, and the performance of confidence. The aircraft were actual. She walked to where the Falcon was positioned, still in its inspection state, partially disassembled at the rotor head, the replaced damper assembly visible, and stood in front of it with her hands in the pockets of her blazer. Evan was on the far side of the hangar, well out of the way. He continued working slowly and without noise, in the particular way he'd gotten very good at over 17 months. After about 2 minutes, Victoria said, without turning around, "You're there, Mercer. The cartwheel squeaks," he said. "I've noticed that for a while," she said. "I kept meaning to tell maintenance. I put in a request about the fluorescent tube in the West Wing 4 days ago," Evan said. "Still waiting on that one, too." She turned around at that. Something in her expression was different from the office version of her, less assembled, more actual. The hangar did that to people. "You know I meant what I said," she said, "about the position." "I know," Evan said. "Are you going to tell me your decision today, or are you going to make me wait another week?" He thought about it. "I got a call from someone at the Pentagon," he said. Victoria's expression shifted. Not surprised exactly, she'd probably been expecting this, but recalibrated. "Marsh," she said. "Someone I served with," Evan said. "There may be an option to work on the government side. Contractor basis, project specific." Victoria nodded slowly. She looked at the Falcon for a moment. "That would be the better career move," she said. It cost her something to say it. He could hear it in the flatness of her voice, the professional override on the personal reaction. "It might be," he said. "I haven't decided." "What are you deciding between?" she said. "Specifically." He considered. "Here," he said, "I know what I'm walking into. The building, the people, the aircraft. I know where the problems are." He paused. "The government side is larger. More significant, probably. Larger also means more variables I can't control. More travel, more schedule disruption," Sadie, Victoria said. "Sadie," he agreed. Victoria leaned against the workbench beside her and looked at him with the specific expression she sometimes had when she was doing mental arithmetic on something that wasn't numbers. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask," Evan said. "Your wife," she said. "How long ago?" 3 years, Evan said. She nodded. She didn't say she was sorry. He appreciated that. The condolence reflex was understandable, but it always landed slightly wrong after a certain amount of time, like someone reaching for a door handle on a room you'd already learned to live inside. "Do you think she'd want you to stay on the ground?" Victoria said. Evan was quiet. "Because the version of you that I've seen operate, Victoria said, in a cockpit, with a problem that needed solving, that wasn't a man staying on the ground by choice. That was a man who'd been keeping something on a shelf for 3 years and picked it up, and it fit exactly the same as before. Evan looked at the Falcon. She wasn't wrong. He knew she wasn't wrong, which was the specific discomfort of the moment. Claire didn't want me to stop flying, he said. She worried about it. She worried every time I left, but she never asked me to stop. He paused. She died anyway. The worrying didn't protect her, and the flying didn't hurt her. It was just cancer. Cancer doesn't care about your job. Victoria didn't say anything. I stopped because Sadie needed me there, he said. Was the right call. I'd make it the same way again. He looked at the aircraft. But Sadie's 9 now. She goes to school. She has misses. Patton, she has her teacher. She has a full day that doesn't involve me until 3 o'clock. He paused. I've been treating a problem that doesn't exist the same way it did 3 years ago. That's a very rational way to describe grief, Victoria said quietly. Evan looked at her. I'm not dismissing it, she said. I've watched people hold on to solutions that solved a problem that changed. It's hard to let go of something that worked. Evan was quiet for a moment. How do you know about grief, he said. Victoria looked at the floor for a moment. When she looked up, her expression had the specific quality of someone navigating territory they don't usually cross in professional conversations. My father built this company, she said. He died when I was 26. I took over because there was no one else, and because I had promised him I would. She paused. I've been doing everything exactly the way he would have wanted it done for 4 years, including the parts that don't work anymore. She looked at Evan. You asked. He had asked. He nodded. They stood in the hangar for a moment with nothing between them except the disassembled Falcon and the particular quiet of a large space where the important things had already been said. I'll give you my decision by Friday, Evan said. That works, Victoria said. She pushed off the workbench and started toward the door. She was almost there when she turned back around. The wheel on your cart, she said. What kind of bearing does it take? Evan blinked. Standard 1/2 inch. Why? Because I'm putting in a maintenance request, she said. And I'm going to be unreasonably annoyed if it doesn't get done in 24 hours. She walked out. Evan looked at the cart for a moment. Then at the door she'd gone through. Then back at the Falcon. He pushed the cart toward the exit, and the left wheel squeaked the way it always did, all the way down the corridor and out through the side bay door into the afternoon. He didn't actually decide on Friday. He decided on a Wednesday evening, and the thing that pushed him over wasn't a conversation or a phone call or a logical argument, which was appropriate because the most important decisions he'd made in his life had not been logical arguments. He'd intervened. They'd been moments where the situation showed him something that couldn't be articulated without losing most of what made it true. What happened was this. He picked Sadie up at 3 as usual. They stopped on the way home at a grocery store for milk, and the specific brand of cereal she'd recently decided was the only acceptable breakfast option, a choice she'd made based on criteria Evan had not been fully briefed on. She was walking next to him down the cereal aisle, running her finger along the shelf, reading box fronts with the focused skepticism of a consumer who had been burned before. She stopped in front of a box with a picture of an airplane on it, a children's cereal, the kind with marshmallows in it, which Evan was not going to buy, because he'd tried that once, and the sugar crash had been catastrophic. Dad, Sadie's not a chance, Evan said. I wasn't asking about the cereal, she said, without taking her eyes off the box. She was looking at the airplane on the front. It was a cartoon, bright red, improbably cheerful. When you were flying yesterday, the Army one, I mean. Did you like it, like actually? I flew 2 weeks ago, Evan said. Yesterday. I know. I meant in general when you were doing it. Evan stopped next to her. Yeah, he said, I liked it a lot. More than the cleaning job. Different than the cleaning job. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Like you were good at it? The flying? I was good at it, Evan said. She finally looked up at him with Claire's exact directness. Why are you still deciding? She said. Like, if you're good at something, and you like it, and you can still pick me up at 3, what are you deciding? He looked at his 9-year-old daughter in the cereal aisle. She had a point that was, when stripped of all the layers he'd been wrapping around it, genuinely simple. Fair enough, he said. Can I get the dinosaur one? she said, pointing to a box 3 shelves down. He looked at the sugar content. It was slightly less catastrophic than the marshmallow one. Fine, he said. She grabbed it and put it in the basket, satisfied with the negotiation, which she probably didn't realize she'd won on the wrong front. He called Harris that evening after she was in bed and said yes to the preliminary conversation. The following morning, he walked into Victoria's office at 7:50 before his shift started and told her he was also accepting her offer with the parameters they discussed on a dual engagement basis that Harris had mentioned was structurally possible. Victoria looked at him for a moment across her desk. "You're going to do both," she said. "The projects don't overlap," Evan said. "I checked." "You checked." "Tom Bird helped me work through the logistics last night." He paused. "The schedule still works. Sadie is still the priority. But there's enough room to do the work I'm actually trained for." Victoria leaned back in her chair. She was quiet for a moment. "I want to be clear about something," she said. Evan waited. "This company failed you," she said. "For 17 months you worked here and had knowledge and expertise that could have contributed to this program's safety. And nobody knew because nobody asked. That's on me, not on the hiring process or the org structure or anything else. I created an environment where a man who'd flown more hours than most of my senior engineers had ever reviewed was pushing a mop down my hallways because nobody thought to ask." She looked at him directly. "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life apologizing for that. But I wanted to say it once, clearly, so you know I understand what happened." Evan was quiet for a moment. "You're asking the janitor now," he said. "Technically, you're accepting a senior aviation safety position," she said. "I'm still finishing my shift today," he said. "The East Lab corridor needs attention." Something crossed Victoria Sterling's face, not a smile. Exactly. More like the thing underneath a smile that made it real. "I'll have the paperwork ready by end of day," she said. Evan nodded. He picked up his cap from his knee. "One more thing," he said. She looked at him. "The maintenance request for the cart bearing," he said. "Did that get processed?" Victoria held his gaze for a second. "It will be done by noon," she said. "I appreciate it," Evan said, and walked back out into the corridor. He got to the East Lab hallway at 5:04. He pulled out the mop, ran the water to the correct temperature, set the solution concentration the way he'd always done it, because the floor material in the lab corridor was a specific composite that reacted badly to higher concentrations. And he started at the far end and worked toward the elevator, the way he'd been doing for 17 months. The cartwheel squeaked all the way down. For now, it still did. He finished the corridor at 7:30, cleaned the mop, restocked the supply cart, clocked out with 3 hours left in his shift because the new paperwork was waiting, and because Victoria Sterling's lawyer had apparently been up since 6 and wanted to go through terms before noon. He stopped at the cart on his way out and looked at the left wheel. A small thing. A squeaking wheel in a quiet hallway. 4 million people had watched him fly an experimental helicopter and land it in front of defense officials. And none of that had felt as strange as this specific Tuesday morning when he was about to walk out of the maintenance bay and into a different version of his own life. He pushed the cart into its bay, hung his uniform on the hook, and put on his jacket. Outside, the morning was cool and overcast. The sky the particular flat gray of a day that hasn't decided yet what it wants to be. Evan Mercer stood in the parking lot for a moment. He thought about a cracked harmonic damper. He thought about Garrett Webb's face when they'd found it. He thought about Dale Holt saying, 23 years, "I will not put myself in a cockpit I don't trust," and meaning every word of it. He thought about Sadie in the cereal aisle, saying, "If you're good at something and you like it, and you can still pick me up at 3, what are you deciding?" He got in his truck. He drove to the lawyer's office. The meeting took 2 hours and covered a considerable amount of ground terms, scope, schedule parameters, the specific clause that Evan had insisted on, and that had required 3 rewrites before it said exactly what he needed it to say. Primary schedule commitment to family responsibilities takes precedence over all professional obligations, with the exception of active safety-critical situations, as defined by mutual agreement. It wasn't elegant legal language. It was just true. He signed at 11:40. He was at the front of the school pickup line at 2:58, engine running, radio on low, in the same truck he'd been driving for 3 years with the dent in the rear panel from a parking structure pillar he'd misjudged in the first month after Claire died, when his spatial judgment was off in a way he hadn't recognized at the time. The dent was still there. He'd never fixed it. Some things you kept because they were part of the record. Sadie came out at 3:01, spotted his truck, and ran without looking at her feet. She yanked the door open and climbed in and buckled her seatbelt and looked at him with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting all day to ask a question. "Did you decide?" she said. "I decided," he said. "And I'm going back to aviation," he said. "Still picking you up at 3. Sadie looked at him for a moment. Then she looked out the windshield. Back at him. "Both," she said. "Both," he said. She sat with that for a second. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out her library book. "Okay," she said, and opened to her page. Evan pulled out of the school lot and into the afternoon traffic, and the dented truck moved through the golden gray Virginia afternoon, and Sadie read, and the world continued its ordinary business of being what it was, unchanged by the decisions of one 32-year-old man in a truck, except that for Evan Mercer, everything different in the quiet way that the most important changes always were. Dramatic, not announced. Just a door opening. The first day Evan showed up to Sterling Aeronautics, not as a janitor, was a Monday, and it was strange in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. He wore the same kind of clothes he always wore: dark work pants, a plain button-down, the same boots. He hadn't gone out and bought a new wardrobe to mark the occasion, because that felt like the kind of gesture that was more about performance than reality, and he'd spent enough of his life around people who confused the two. He parked in the same spot at the far end of the lot, out of habit, before realizing he now had a different parking designation, and then deciding to stay where he was anyway, because the walk across the lot gave him 3 minutes of quiet before the building. Security gave him a new badge. It was the same photo they'd taken 17 months ago for the custodial ID, which meant he looked slightly younger in it and was wearing a collar that was marginally less frayed. The security guard, a man named Dennis, who had been waving him through the side gate since the beginning, looked at the new badge designation and then at Evan and then back at the badge. "Senior Aviation Safe," Dennis said. "Apparently," Evan said. "You want to use the main entrance now?" Evan thought about it. "The side gate is fine," he said. Dennis nodded, like that was the correct answer, and waved him through. The office they'd assigned him was on the second floor of the main building. A small room with a window that looked out over the east hangar roof, and a desk that had clearly been in storage somewhere because one of the legs had a shim under it to compensate for a floor that was perfectly level. He checked the shim, found it adequately stable, and sat down. The chair was new. Someone had clearly gone to the effort of ordering a new chair for the new position, and he appreciated the thought, even though the chair had that specific new chair stiffness that took weeks to work out. He had a computer, a phone, and a stack of binders that Garrett had left on the desk, with a sticky note that read, "Background reading. Start with the red one." He started with the red one. It was the full engineering history of the Falcon XR-8 program, from an initial concept through current development status, and it was 430 pages long, which meant Garrett had been thorough in a way that was both professional and slightly unkind, given that it was 7 in the morning. Evan read it the way he read technical material, quickly, selectively, building a structural map of the information rather than reading linearly, flagging items with the small sticky tabs he'd brought from home, because office supply requests took a week and he needed them now. By 10:30, he had 17 flags in the red binder and a legal pad with 12 questions written in his specific small handwriting, the compressed print of someone who'd spent years filling out flight logs in moving aircraft and learned to write small and precisely. He found Garrett in the avionics lab at 11, standing over a workstation with Marcus Teal and a woman Evan didn't recognize who was introduced as Dr. Patricia Yoon, the structural analysis lead who had been with Sterling for 6 years and who shook Evan's hand with the directness of someone who didn't have time for social preamble and had probably been that way since childhood. "Red binder questions?" Garrett said, looking at the legal pad. 12 of them, Evan said. Garrett looked at Patricia. "I told you he'd have questions by noon." "You said lunch," Patricia said. "It's 11:30. Close enough." Garrett pulled up a stool. "Let's go." They went through the questions standing around the workstation. Some of them Garrett could answer immediately. Some required Patricia to pull up reference files. Two of them questions 8 and 11, both relating to the tail rotor geometry correction that was still in the specification phase, produced a 20-minute conversation that drew in Marcus and eventually two other engineers who happened to be working nearby and got pulled in by the gravitational field of a technical argument that was going somewhere interesting. Evan was not the smartest person in that room on the engineering side. He knew that clearly and had no ego about it. Patricia Yuan had forgotten more structural analysis than he'd ever formally studied, and Marcus, despite being young enough to make Evan feel briefly conscious of his age, had a fluid command of the aerodynamics modeling that was genuinely impressive. What Evan brought was different. The physical experience of flying rotary wing aircraft through the specific conditions that the engineering models were trying to predict. The knowledge of what those numbers felt like from inside the cockpit, the gap between what the simulation said and what the aircraft communicated through your hands and feet and the base of your spine when you were actually in it. That gap, he was learning quickly, was exactly where Sterling Aeronautics had been getting into trouble. The model says the rotor transition is stable at 89 knots with the corrected geometry, Marcus said, pointing at the screen. We've run it 40 times. The model said the original geometry was stable too, Evan said. Marcus opened his mouth and then closed it. Patricia looked at Evan with the expression of someone recalibrating. What would you need to see to trust the model, she said. It was the right question. Evan thought about it genuinely before answering. Run it with the variance parameters wider. The current model is optimized for the design spec. I want to see what happens at the edges 10% outside nominal on rotor speed, temperature differential, blade loading. If it's stable across all of those, I'll trust it more. That's another week of modeling time, Marcus said. It's less time than another damper inspection after the next flight, Evan said. Marcus nodded slowly. He wasn't arguing, he was adjusting. Evan was starting to understand going to be the core of this job, not the dramatic moments, not the flight, but this. Standing in a room at 11:30 in the morning, going through questions 12 at a time, building the case that the thing they were about to do was actually going to work before they did it, with people who were smart enough to know he was right and honest enough to accept it, even when it added a week to the schedule. It was less glamorous than flying. He was fairly certain, more important. Dale Holt found him on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks into the new position, in the way that Dale Holt did most things without announcement, materializing in a space when you hadn't heard him approach, which was an unusual quality in a man of his size. Evan was in the hangar, standing near the Falcon's tail section, where the geometry correction was being implemented, watching two technicians work with the focused but uninvasive attention of someone who wanted to see the process without interrupting it. Mercer, Holt said. Holt, Evan said. They stood side by side for a moment, watching the technicians. It was the comfortable silence of two people who'd both spent significant portions of their lives in environments where unnecessary noise was a liability. I looked up your record, Holt said eventually. I figured, Evan said. 11 years, Fort Rucker. The safety evaluation work. Holt paused. You were the one who wrote the modified tail rotor failure protocol that came out of the 18 incident. Partially, Evan said. 3 of us wrote it. I used that protocol, Holt said. A training scenario in 2020. It's a good protocol. Okay, Evan said. Holt was quiet. For a moment, you should have told someone who you were, he said. There was no accusation in it. It was just an observation being offered. Evan looked at the tail section. I needed a specific schedule, he said. The custodial job had it. The positions I was qualified for in aviation didn't. You could have talked to who? Evan said. Not sharply. Just a question. Holt thought about it. Fair, he said. They watched the technicians for another minute. How's she flying? Holt said. He meant the aircraft the way pilots always meant. Aircraft, when they said she, not sentiment, just the habitual pronoun of someone who'd spent a life in cockpits. The geometry correction looks right, Evan said. The modeling is being expanded before we clear her for the next flight evaluation. Should have results by end of next week. And when we fly, Holt said. Who's in the seat? You are, Evan said, if you'll take it. Holt looked at him sideways. You just told me the damper that could have killed me was cracked in 2 places, Holt said. You're telling me to get back in. I'm telling you we found it before you flew, Evan said. We fixed it. We're checking everything else with wider variance parameters than the original spec required. When you get in that aircraft, you'll have more information about its condition than any test pilot has had on any aircraft I've been involved with. He looked at Holt directly. She trusted your instincts when you said no. I'm asking you to trust the process that came out of what happened when you said no. Holt was quiet for a long moment. You going to be in the control room when we fly? He said. Yes, Evan said. You going to tell me if something feels wrong? That's the job, Evan said. Holt nodded once. It was the nod of a man who had made a decision and didn't need to perform it. End of next week, he said. Get me the modeling results. He walked away the same way he'd arrived, quietly, without ceremony. Evan turned back to the tail section and watched the technicians work. The thing nobody had warned him about, though he probably should have expected it, was the email. The volume of it, though that was substantial. It was the specific content of a certain subset of emails that arrived in his new Sterling account, forwarded from a general inquiry address that his assistant, a composed, efficient woman named Brianna, who had been handling executive correspondence for 2 years and had the specific skill of filtering signals from noise with minimum drama, flagged as requiring his personal attention. These are from other pilots, Brianna told him, setting a printed folder on his desk on a Thursday morning. Active duty, former service, civilian. About 60 of them in the first 2 weeks. I filtered out the media requests, the ones that are clearly just... She made a gesture that encompassed a category of email that needed no further description. These are the ones that seemed genuine. Evan opened the folder. She was right that they were genuine. They were from men and women who had left aviation for reasons that were variations on his own family, injury, circumstances that required a choice, and they'd made the choice and were living with it. Some of them had gotten back in some form. Most of them hadn't. They weren't asking him for anything. Not exactly. They were writing because his specific situation, the particularity of it, the janitor detail, the daughter, the helicopter had apparently said something to them that they hadn't been able to articulate to themselves. One letter from a former Army pilot named Sandra Okafor, who was now teaching middle school in Georgia, said, I've been telling myself for 4 years that I chose my kids over my career, and that was the right call, and I believe that. Reading about you, I realized I'd also told myself that was the only option, that it had to be one or the other. I don't know if that was true, or if I just needed it to be true because it made the choice easier. Evan read that letter twice. He didn't know what to write back. He set it aside and came back to it the next evening, at the kitchen table after Sadie was asleep, and sat there for a while, looking at the letter, and then at the table's worn wood grain, and then at the corner drawer he still hadn't opened. He wrote back eventually. He didn't give her advice because it wasn't his place, and he didn't know her situation. He said, the version that's right for is probably different from the version that was right for me. What I can tell you is that the choice I made at each point was the right choice for that point. The question I had to ask myself was whether the circumstances had changed enough that the choice needed change too. You're the only one who can answer that for your situation. He reread it before sending and decided it was honest without being presumptuous. He answered 31 of the letters over the next 3 weeks, in the evenings after Sadie was in bed, at the kitchen table that needed refinishing. He didn't answer all of them. He wasn't equipped to, and it wasn't his responsibility, but the ones from pilots specifically, the ones that raised technical or professional questions he could actually address, he answered because it seemed like the right thing to do, and he'd learned over his life that the right thing to do was usually more straightforward than people made it. Tom Bird drove up from Nashville on a Saturday in the 3rd week. He arrived at noon in an impractical pickup truck that was too large for any evident practical purpose and parked it with the specific ease of a man who drove large vehicles because he found their scale genuinely useful to his psychological state. He was 61, silver-haired, built like someone who had maintained physical fitness for decades with grim efficiency and no particular enjoyment of the process. Sadie opened the door before he knocked because she'd seen the truck from the living room window. You must be Tom, she said. Tom looked at her. You must be the one who runs this operation, he said. Sadie considered this. Kind of, she said. Dad does the cooking. Smart division of labor. Sadie stepped aside to let him in with the proprietary confidence of a 9-year-old in her own home, which meant she was comfortable with him already, which Evan noted from the kitchen where he was making lunch. Tom sat at the kitchen table, the table that needed refinishing, that Evan still hadn't gotten to, and accepted a cup of coffee and looked around the apartment with the specific gaze of someone who had known a person for a long time and was updating their mental picture. Sadie installed herself at the hopel with the expressed intention of doing her weekend reading homework, but actually with the purpose of monitoring the adult conversation, which she did with the poorly concealed focus of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned that adults could tell. Tom said to Evan, who was assembling sandwiches, "How's it feel?" Weird, Evan said. In good ways, mostly. They treating you right? Garrett's team is good. Patricia Yoon is excellent. Victoria, as he paused, choosing the word trying. That's the best thing you can say about a boss, Tom said. She accepted accountability in front of the DoD people and didn't throw anyone else under the vehicle, Evan said. That's not a small thing. Tom nodded. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Harris called me, he said. I figured he would. He's pleased with how the preliminary conversations are going. The project scope, they're looking at the next-gen evaluation. Work, it's significant, Evan. It's the kind of thing you'd have been doing at the highest level if you'd stayed in, Evan said. He brought the sandwiches to the table. Sadie looked at her sandwich and then at him. Turkey again, she said. I bought a large pack, Evan said. You've been buying large packs of turkey for 3 years, she said. It's efficient, Evan said. Dad thinks efficiency is a personality trait, Sadie said to Tom. Tom pressed his mouth together against a smile and failed. Tom said. Noted, Tom said. They ate. The conversation moved the way Saturday afternoon conversations did, when they weren't being forced sideways through different topics, Sadie inserting observations with the timing of someone who'd grown up around adult conversation and knew when a gap was navigable, Tom asking her about schools and receiving a surprisingly detailed response about the current political situation in her classroom's reading group. He'd intervened, which apparently involved disputed shelf rights and a librarian who was managing the conflict with mixed results. After lunch, Sadie went to her room to actually do her homework, having apparently decided she'd gathered sufficient intelligence from the adult conversation, and Evan and Tom sat at the table with refilled coffee. I need to ask you something, Tom said. Go ahead. Are you doing okay? Tom said. Not professionally. Actually, Evan looked at the table. Most days, he said. And the other days? The other days are the other days, Evan said. He turned his own cup in his hands, same as Tom, which made him briefly conscious of the habit. It's been 3 years. The shape of it changes. It doesn't get smaller exactly. He paused. I've got more around it now. More going on. Which isn't the same as it being less. Tom said it's not. A pause. She'd be pleased, Tom said. About this. I know, Evan said. She always said. Evan said again, gently, not cutting him off, just arriving at the same place by a shorter route. Tom nodded. He'd known Evan long enough to understand the compression, the way he processed things internally so thoroughly that by the time they came up in conversation, he'd already been living with them for a while. They sat for a moment in the kind of quiet that old friends can occupy without it requiring anything. She looks like her, Tom said eventually, meaning Sadie. Every year, Evan said. He stopped.
Yeah, Tom said.
Evan stood up and took the cups to the sink. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon was doing its Saturday thing, a couple of kids on bikes going past in the parking lot, the broken gate making its familiar sound when someone pushed through it. Everything ordinary. Stay for dinner, Evan said. If you're making something other than turkey, Tom said. No, I was going to make pasta, Evan said. I'll stay. The Falcon flew its rescheduled evaluation. On a Friday, 3 weeks after Evan had signed the paperwork, and 5 weeks after the flight that had started everything. Evan was in the ground control station, a converted room in the operations building with monitoring equipment running on 8 screens, showing telemetry, video feeds, weather data, and the radio communications between Holt and the ground crew. He sat at the center's console with Patricia on his left, and the lead flight systems engineer on the specific concentrated quiet of a room full of people who were paying very close attention. Victoria was in the room. She stood at the back, which was where she'd chosen to be, close enough to see everything, and far enough that she wasn't part of the operational chain of command. It was the right call, and which Evan had privately noted as evidence that she was learning. Holt's voice came through the speakers, calm and routine, as he ran through the pre-flight checks. "Control, how's my telemetry feed?" "Feed is clean," the flight systems engineer said. "All channels nominal. Copy, beginning startup sequence." Evan watched the screens. The telemetry data populated in real-time rotor RPM, engine temperatures, hydraulic pressures, the whole physiological portrait of an aircraft coming to life. He watched the numbers with the part of his brain that had been doing this for 11 years and knew what nominal looked like at every stage of the process. Everything looked right. The Falcon lifted at 9:43. The hover phase was clean. The transition to forward flight was clean. Evan watched the airspeed indicator climb on the telemetry screen, 60 knots, 70, 75, and felt the room's collective breath hold in the specific way of people who remembered what had happened the last time someone had pushed through that range. "Coming up on 80, Holt said. His voice was even, professionally neutral, the tone of a man who was flying the aircraft and reporting its condition and not allowing himself to feel anything about it beyond the professional task. "Copy 80, the flight systems engineer said. "Transition feels clean," Holt said. "Abnormal feedback through 83. Evan watched the data. The tail rotor parameters were holding. The corrected geometry was doing what the expanded modeling Seaton said it would do. He watched the frequency analysis on the vibration sensors, the specific harmonic range where the damper had been generating anomalous data before, and it was flat. Clean. The corrected damper showed nothing. 89, Holt said. "Transition complete. Aircraft is stable," the room exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale. It was the specific quiet release of a room full of professionals who had been holding something in reserve and were now allowed to let it go. Patricia made a note on her tablet. The flight systems engineer said something into his headset to the ground crew. Two engineers at the side console exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. He looked at the telemetry screens and felt something that he would have had trouble naming exactly, but that had to do with between what could have happened and what did. Holt took the aircraft through the full demonstration profile. Every transition clean, every speed range nominal. The vibration data was flat across the entire operating envelope. At 11:07, the Falcon landed. In the ground control room, nobody clapped. Wasn't the culture of this particular kind of work. The absence of disaster wasn't applause-worthy. It was the baseline requirement, and celebrating the baseline was a category error that people in flight safety understood implicitly. What happened instead was that people began doing the next thing, pulling data, writing notes, beginning the debrief process with the slightly lighter energy of professionals who had gotten it right and were ready to keep going. Victoria pushed off from the back wall and walked toward Evan. He was already pulling up the telemetry archive for the debrief documentation. She said, "Full data review will take a couple of days," he said. "But from what I saw in real time, the corrections held across the entire envelope. The demonstration can proceed, pending the data review and Holt's debrief," Evan said. "But yes, I think it can." Victoria nodded. She looked at the screens for a moment at the Falcon on the landing camera feed, sitting clean and still on the runway in the morning light. "What I keep thinking about," she said. Evan waited. The other 18 engineers who looked at that damper and said, "It was fine," she said. They weren't stupid. They weren't careless. They looked at that component and passed it. She paused. Why? Because the inspection protocol wasn't designed to find that specific failure mode, Evan said. The crack was in the inner collar. The standard visual inspection doesn't reach it. You need the die test on full disassembly. So the protocol was inadequate, she said. The protocol was written based on failure modes that had been observed before, Evan said. This was a new failure mode in a new component configuration. Nobody had seen it before because nobody had built this specific component before. He paused. That's not a failure of the engineers. It's a failure of the process not keeping up with the design, which is my job, Victoria said. It's everybody's job, Evan said, which means it's also nobody's job, unless someone makes it specifically somebody's job. She looked at him. Is that your way of asking for expanded scope? She said. It's my way of identifying a structural gap, he said. What you do with it is your call. She was quiet for a moment. Write it up, she said. Whatever you think needs to change in the inspection protocol. Full recommendation. That's going to conflict with some of the existing timelines, Evan said. Write it up anyway, she said. I'll deal with the timelines. She left the control room. Evan turned back to the telemetry archive and began pulling the data segments he needed for the debrief documentation, working through the file structure with the focused efficiency of someone who was 3 hours into a task that was going to take 6. Marcus Teal appeared at his shoulder at about hour 4, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had something to say and wasn't sure of the timing. Here, Marcus said, setting 1 cup down. Thanks, Evan said without looking up. A pause. Can I ask you something? Marcus said. Sure. When you were flying the aircraft that first day, Marcus said, the feeling at 73 knots on the descent. What did it actually feel like? Like the physical sensation. Evan stopped typing. He thought about it honestly, not the engineering version of it, but the actual physical memory. It's like when you're driving and you hit a patch of road that's slightly different surface texture, he said. You feel it through the wheel. You don't see it coming. You don't hear it, really. You just feel it. And the feeling is distinct enough that your brain flags it immediately as different without you having to tell it to. Marcus nodded slowly. The sensors we have on the airframe, do they capture that? Some of it, Evan said. The vibration sensors capture frequency and amplitude, but the directionality, the way it comes, through the controls specifically, through the collective versus the cyclic, how it feels in the pedals, that's harder to instrument. He looked at Marcus. That's why the pilot in the loop feedback matters. The aircraft tells the pilot things it doesn't tell the sensors. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Evan could see him turning this over. We've been treating the pilot data as a narrative account, Marcus said, slowly. Post-flight debrief. Qualitative. We process it separately from the telemetry. Yes, Evan said. That's backwards, Marcus said. Yes, Evan said. Marcus picked up his coffee cup and looked at the screen and then at his own tablet and then at nothing in particular for a moment. I need to think about this, he said. Take your time, Evan said. It's a big change to how you process flight data. Can I talk to you about it? When I've thought it through. My door's open, Evan said. Marcus left. Evan turned back to the telemetry archive and kept working, and the afternoon moved through its hours with the specific texture of work that was real and necessary and connected to something that mattered. At 2:52, he saved the file he was working on, marked it for Garrett's review, and closed the laptop. He got to the school at 2:58. Sadie came out at 3:03, which was 2 minutes later than usual, and she was walking with a girl Evan didn't recognize who was gesturing with both hands in the way of someone deep in a story. Sadie listened with genuine focus, which meant she liked this person, or the story was good enough to earn it. She said something to the girl at the school steps, and the girl went to a different car, and Sadie ran to the truck the way she always ran, without looking at her feet. Buckled, looked at him. The helicopter flew today, he said. Repaired one. How'd it go? Clean, he said. Everything the way it should be. She nodded like this was the expected outcome, and she'd never doubted it. Emma's friend Sophia wants to be an engineer, Sadie said, apparently connecting something. She says she wants to build the inside parts of airplanes, the parts that make them not crash. That's a good thing to want to build, Evan said. I told her I know someone who finds the parts that are wrong, Sadie said. Before they crash, Evan pulled out of the lot. What did she say, he said. She said that sounds like detective work, Sadie said. She's not wrong, Evan said. Sadie pulled out her library book, a new one, spine intact because she'd only had it since Tuesday. They drove home through the afternoon, and the conversation settled into the specific, comfortable silence of two people who had said what needed saying and were now simply occupying the same moving space together, which was a thing Evan had learned to understand as its own kind of sufficiency. Everything needed to be said. Some things just needed to be present. The truck moved through the gold Virginia afternoon with the particular ease of a vehicle that knew the route, past the grocery store, where Sadie had asked her question, in the cereal aisle, past the turn that led to Riverdale Elementary, past the parking structure, with the pillar he'd misjudged 3 years ago, the dent still in the rear panel, the record of a specific moment that had been survived and folded into the ordinary fabric of continuing. At home, Evan made pasta, because Tom had made him conscious of the turkey situation. Sadie ate 2 servings, and then did her homework at the kitchen table, the one that needed refinishing. That was still waiting while Evan washed the dishes and looked out the window at the parking lot, and the broken gate and the ordinary geography of a life that was, in its specific unspectacular way, genuinely his. After Sadie was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with the corner drawer in his peripheral vision the way it always was, the drawer he hadn't opened in 3 years. He sat there for a long time. Then he pulled the drawer open. Claire's reading glasses were right at the front. Small, wire-framed, one of the arms slightly bent from where she'd sat on them once and refused to get them fixed because she said the bend gave them character. The small notebook was underneath, her handwriting visible through the cover, the slanted cursive that started careful and got excited as it went. He didn't open the notebook. He just held the glasses in his hand for a minute. They were lighter than he remembered. They were always lighter than he remembered. He put them back. He closed the drawer most of the way, not all the way, just mostly. Then he got up, went to the storage closet in the hallway, and found the refinishing supplies he'd bought 8 months ago and never used. He carried them to the kitchen table. He read them the instructions on the label twice because he hadn't done this before, and he didn't want to damage the wood. He worked on the table until midnight. It didn't look new when he stopped. That wasn't the point. The point was the work-specific physical attention of doing something with your hands that required care and produced a visible result. The surface coming back to itself under the process, saints, the grain of the old wood emerging from what had accumulated over it. He cleaned up and stood back and looked at it. Still the same table. Still the imperfect estate sale table that Claire had loaded into a rented van on a Saturday morning because it was exactly right. Just cleaner now, truer to what it actually was. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. In the morning, Sadie came to the kitchen for breakfast and stopped when she saw the table. She ran her hand along the surface. "You fixed it," she said. "Fixed," Evan said, from the counter where the coffee was brewing. "Refinished, what's the difference?" "Fixing is when something's broken," he said. "This wasn't broken, it just needed attention." Sadie looked at the table, and then at him with the specific expression she had when she was deciding whether an adult's distinction was meaningful or just an adult being particular about words. She apparently decided it was meaningful. "It looks good," she said, and got the cereal from the shelf. Evan poured his coffee and looked at the table in the early morning light. It did look good. Not new, not perfect. Just honestly itself, which was the best a thing could be. The rescheduled demonstration happened on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the original date, and this time Dale Holt walked to the cockpit without hesitation. Evan watched him go from his position near the ground control station entrance, not inside, yet, just standing at the threshold with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago because he'd forgotten to drink it. The morning was overcast and cool, the kind of sky that didn't commit to anything, and the Falcon sat on the tarmac looking exactly like what it was, a genuinely exceptional piece of engineering that had almost become something else entirely because of a culture that had confused speed with progress. The DoD representatives were back. Colonel Marsh was there, with 2 people Evan didn't recognize, but whose bearing communicated procurement authority clearly enough. There were fewer cameras. This time, the media interest had shifted to following Evan's appointment rather than the aircraft program, which meant most of the journalists who descended on Sterling after the original video had moved on to the next story. Was fine. Better, actually. The demonstration didn't need an audience of people who were there for the drama. It needed an audience of people who understood what they were watching. Victoria stood near the observation area in a dark jacket, both hands in her pockets, watching Holt's pre-flight walkthrough with the specific expression of someone who had done the work to get here and was now trying to be present in the moment instead of managing it. Evan had noticed that, about her over the past several weeks, she was learning to be in the room instead of running it. It was an uncomfortable skill for someone who had been running rooms since she was 26, and she wasn't always good at it, and that imperfection made the effort more legible and more real. Garrett Webb appeared at Evan's shoulder. How do you feel about it? Garrett said. I feel like we did the work, Evan said. That's not quite an answer. It's the only answer I've got, Evan said. The rest is Holt's. Garrett nodded. He'd learned over the past weeks that Evan wasn't being evasive when he said things like that. He was being precise. The work was what you could control. Everything else was the aircraft and not the pilot and the laws of physics. And those three things had a conversation with each other that no one on the ground could fully predict. Holt's voice came through the comm as he settled into the cockpit. Pilot is in position. Beginning startup sequence. Copy pilot, the flight systems engineer said from inside the station. All channels are live. You are clear to begin. Evan went inside and took his position at the center console. The next 40 minutes were the most focused he'd been since the day he'd flown the aircraft himself. He watched the telemetry with the same dual attention he'd always brought to high-stakes situations, the analytical layer that processed the data and the intuitive layer underneath it that flagged things the analytical layer might catch too late. Both layers stayed quiet through the taxi, through the lift, through the hover phase, and the transition to forward flight. 60 knots. Clean. 70. Clean. The room held itself together with professional discipline as the airspeed climbed toward the range that had defined everything that had followed. 83. The tail rotor telemetry was nominal. The vibration sensors were flat. 87. Clean. Anomalous harmonics. 91. Transition is clean, Holt said. His voice was the same even professional tone it always was. But Evan had been around pilots long enough to hear the thing underneath it, a very slight decompression, the release of a man who had trusted the process and found that the process had been worth trusting. Full demonstration envelope. Aircraft is stable. Evan sat back from the console very slightly. Just a few centimeters. Just enough. Patricia made a note on her tablet without looking up. Marcus, at the side station, exhaled in a way that was completely unprofessional and completely human, and then looked around to see if anyone had noticed. And Evan very carefully did not acknowledge that he had. The Falcon flew the complete demonstration profile over the next 30 minutes, every speed range, every maneuver in the specified parameters, every transition that the program required. The telemetry data was clean throughout. When Holt brought it back and set it down at 11:43, the touchdown was the kind of landing that a pilot makes when he's been flying well and knows it, not aggressive, not demonstrative, just exactly what it needed to be. Colonel Marsh was already walking toward Victoria when Evan came out of the ground control station. He didn't approach them. That wasn't his place, and he didn't need to hear it. He could read it in Marsh's posture, the forward lean of a man who has decided and is communicating the decision, the specific quality of Victoria's stillness that was not suppression, but genuine relief finding its shape. Garrett fell into step beside him. Program's back on, Garrett said quietly. Looks like it, Evan said. How do you feel about that? Evan looked at the Falcon, still on the runway, ground crew approaching with the post-flight equipment. I feel like they're going to need a better inspection protocol before the next flight phase, he said. Garrett almost smiled. I thought you might say something like that. The recommendation report is on your desk, Evan said. Has been for a week. I know, Garrett said. Victoria approved it this morning. We're implementing the expanded die test protocol on all primary damper components before any flight evaluation going forward. Evan looked at him. She approved it. Before the demonstration, he said. Yesterday afternoon, Garrett said. She said she wasn't going to wait to see how the flight went before doing what was right. He paused. I thought you'd want to know that. Evan was quiet for a moment. He said, I did want to know that. He walked back toward the main building, and the morning moved on around him with the ordinary business of a program that had just survived its crisis and was beginning to understand what came next. Colonel Marsh found Evan in the hallway outside the ground control station at 12:30, and Evan understood from the deliberateness of the approach that this conversation had been intended since before the man had arrived that morning. Marsh was 60, silver-haired, with the economy of movement of someone who had spent decades making physical discipline habitual. He shook Evan's hand with the grip of someone who meant it. Good to see you in a professional capacity again, Marsh said. Same, Evan said. They fell into a walk without discussing it, down the corridor toward the main building, The way military people sometimes conduct conversations in motion, which makes them feel less like interrogations. Your work on the inspection protocol is already being discussed at our level, Marsh said. The expanded variance modeling, the pilot in the loop feedback integration. Marcus Teal sent over a preliminary paper on the methodology 2 days ago. Evan hadn't known that. He filed it for later. It's good work, Marsh said. The kind of systemic thinking that's been missing from the evaluation process for a while. He paused. Harris told me you've been reviewing the preliminary terms on the contractor engagement. I have, Evan said.
Where are you on it?
Evan thought about how to be honest without being more complicated than the situation required. The work itself is what I want to be doing, he said. The structure works. The schedule parameters work. He paused. I just want to make sure the scope is what Harris described, and not what it tends to become 6 months in. Marsh looked at him sideways. Meaning? Meaning that contractor arrangements in this sector have a tendency to expand, Evan said. The initial scope is clear, and the schedule is manageable, and then the project has a complication, and the timeline slides, and the request comes in for more availability, and the answer is always framed as temporary. He kept his voice, even because he wasn't accusing anyone. He was describing a pattern that was as familiar as weather. I have a 9-year-old daughter. The schedule isn't a preference. It's a requirement. Marsh was quiet for a moment. I understand that, he said. Then, after a pause that suggested he was deciding to say something he hadn't planned to, I missed my son's high school graduation. I was in a briefing in Brussels that had been classified as essential 6 weeks earlier, and then got extended the day before. I've thought about that graduation about twice a week for the past 14 years. Evan didn't say anything. I'm not saying that to make you feel like you're making the right call, Marsh said. You clearly already know you are. I'm saying it because I want you to understand that when I tell you we'll hold the scope, I mean it with the particular conviction of someone who knows what it costs when we don't. They walked for a moment. Okay, Evan said. Okay, you believe me, or okay, we can proceed? Evan said. Marsh nodded once, and the conversation settled into its conclusion with the efficiency of 2 people who had said what needed saying and were ready for the next thing. The formal signing of the government contractor agreement happened on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room that was considerably less impressive than the occasion probably warranted fluorescent lights. A coffee set up in the corner that had been there since morning and was communicating this through its aroma. A stack of document that the lawyer on Evan's side and the lawyer on the government's side had been arguing about in a collegial but genuine way for the better part of 2 weeks. Tom was there because Evan had asked him to be, and because Tom would have shown up uninvited anyway. The Sterling agreement was already in place. The government engagement layered on top of it with the clear delineation that Harris and Evan had negotiated project-specific, defined scope, the schedule clause written with the specificity that Evan had insisted on, and that the government lawyers had pushed back on twice before accepting that he wasn't going to move on it. He signed in 4 places. It took about 2 minutes. Tom clapped him on the shoulder on the way out, which was the Tom Bird version of an emotional response. Your father would have Tom started. Don't, Evan said, but without any sharpness in it. Right, Tom said. Okay. They walked out into the afternoon together, and Tom's impractical truck was in the lot next to Evan's dented vehicle. Yes, he'd intervened. And they stood there for a moment in the particular way of 2 people who have been through a long stretch of something and are now on the other side of it. Now, Tom said. I pick up Sadie at 3, Evan said. Tom checked his watch. It was 2:41. You've got 19 minutes, Tom said. Evan said. He drove to the school with the specific alertness of someone who had spent the day in rooms full of gravity and was now transitioning back to the part of his life that had always mattered more, the part that had been the reason for all the decisions going back to the first one when he'd left the army, and the one in the middle when he'd taken the custodial job, and the most recent ones that had changed the shape of the next several years. He was at the front of the line at 2:57. Sadie came out at 3:01, backpack on, walking fast with the focused energy of someone who had been sitting in a desk all day and needed to move. She spotted the truck, and for just a moment before she started running, Evan saw her face in the unguarded half second before she knew he was watching just a kid. Seeing her father's truck, the specific ease that landed in her face at the sight of it. That half second was worth more than anything that had happened in the conference room. She ran. She yanked the door open. She got in and buckled and looked at him with the directness she'd inherited from her mother. "Big day," she said. "Medium day," he said. "I signed some papers." "The flying papers?" Something like that. She considered this with appropriate 9-year-old gravity. "Are you happy about it?" He thought about that honestly. The way he tried to think about things, she asked him directly. He said, "I am." She seemed satisfied. She reached into her backpack and then stopped and looked at him again. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, my recital is Thursday," she said. "The spring one. The one I've been practicing the arm thing for." She did a brief, illustrative version of the arm thing, which appeared to involve a specific angle of elbow that she'd been working on for 2 weeks. Evan said, "Front row." "You said that last time too, and you were in the second row," she said. "The parent ahead of me was very tall," Evan said. "Get there earlier," she said, with the practicality of someone who has thought this through. "I'll get there earlier," he said. She pulled out her library book, new one again, spine intact, and he drove, and the afternoon settled around them the way it always did, unhurried and ordinary and entirely sufficient. Thursday evening arrived the way important evenings do, feeling like a regular evening, right up till you were in the middle of it, and it became itself. Evan was sitting in the front row of the Ridgefield Community Center's main hall, which held about 200 people and smelled of folding chairs and the industrial carpet cleaner that community centers apparently purchased in bulk nationally. He had gotten there 40 minutes early, which was unnecessary, but definitive on the front row question. The seat next to him was occupied by his jacket because he needed to hold it for Mrs. Patton, who was running late. Around him, the hall was filling with the specific population of a children's dance recital, parents with phones already out, grandparents navigating the chair rows with patient determination, younger siblings operating at their particular frequency of contained chaos. The lights were at 3/4 brightness, the way they were before things started. The stage curtain was closed. His phone buzzed. A message from Harris. Marsh approved the expanded methodology paper. Marcus Teal is being requested for working group presentation next month. Thought you'd want to know. He read it and put the phone in his pocket. He thought about Marcus in the ground control room, exhaling in that completely unprofessional and completely human way when the Falcon's telemetry came back clean. He thought about Garrett standing in the maintenance bay with the cracked damper under the light, pressing his hands flat on the inspection table. He thought about Patricio and saying that's a week of modeling time and accepting Evan's answer without making him justify it twice. He thought about Victoria Sterling standing at the back of the control room during Holt's flight, far enough back that she wasn't part of the operational chain, present enough that she understood what was happening. People trying. People getting some of it wrong and some of it right, and continuing anyway, was the actual texture of the work. And it was also, he'd come to understand, the actual texture of most things that mattered. Mrs. Patton arrived with 4 minutes to spare, breathless and apologetic, settled into the seat next to him with the comfortable efficiency of someone who had attended 17 of these events and knew the exact level of pre-show chaos that was normal. The lights went down. The curtain opened. Evan had seen Sadie practice the routine at home approximately 37 times in the past 6 weeks, which meant he knew every count and every transition and the specific place in the second verse where the footwork changed. He knew it well enough that when the music started and the kids moved into their opening positions, he was watching not for the performance, but for Sadie, specifically. The way you watch for one person in a crowd when you know exactly where they are and what they look like and what their face does when they're concentrating. She was third from the left, which was the position she'd told him about. She had the arm thing down the elbow angle, was exactly right. Expression was the expression she always had when she was doing something that required her full attention. Not stiff, but inward. The way her mother had looked when she was reading something that had caught her completely. Halfway through the performance, on a turn that Evan had seen her nail in the living room, approximately 20 times, Sadie's foot landed slightly wrong, and the turn wobbled. A fall. Not even close to a fall. A wobble the kind that would be invisible to 95% of the audience, and visible only to the people who knew the choreography and the people who had been watching her specifically. She felt it. He could see her feel it. A micro-expression, a fraction of a second, the internal acknowledgement of the thing that went slightly wrong. And then she kept going. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't adjust her face into anything effortful or compensating. She just continued the routine from the next beat, on time, with the same arm angle and the same focus, and the wobble dissolved into the sequence and was gone. Evan sat in the front row of the Ridgefield Community Center and felt something that was composed of several things simultaneously, the ordinary parental pride that he suspected was universal and didn't require description. Underneath that, something specific to this moment, this specific 9-year-old person who had grown up with the mother who got sick and a father who was figuring it out and a life that had not been uncomplicated, who had just wobbled in front of 200 people and kept going without making it into anything larger than what it was. He thought about the Falcon at 87 knots, holding steady through the range where everything could have gone wrong and didn't. He thought about a cracked damper found in time. He thought about himself at 32 with a custodial cart and a squeaking wheel, pushing through corridors before sunrise, invisible by default, carrying something that nobody had thought to ask about. He thought about Claire at the estate sale, finding the imperfect table, and knowing it was exactly right. Recovery wasn't the dramatic thing. Recovery was the next beat on time. It was setting the mop down and walking to the cockpit. It was writing the report accurately and letting it stand. It was opening the drawer most of the way and closing it mostly. So it was signing the papers and being in the front row. It was all the ordinary consecutive decisions that added up to a life that was not the life you planned, but was in its specific shape, yet genuinely yours. The performance ended. The kids took their bows. 200 people applauded with the sincere enthusiasm of an audience that had watched children do something that required months of practice and had delivered it imperfectly and completely, which was the only way anything was ever delivered. Sadie found him in the lobby afterward, pushing through the crowd with her backpack over one shoulder and her dance bag over the other. And she ran the last 10 feet the way she always ran, without looking at her feet. He caught her in a hug that was the kind of hug that didn't need to be performed for anyone. She pulled back and looked at him. "Did you see it?" she said. He knew what she meant. "I saw you recover," he said. She looked at him for a moment, with the specific expression of a 9-year-old deciding whether that was a diplomatic answer or an honest one. She apparently decided it was honest. "The floor was slippery," she said. He said, "I stuck the rest of it." "You did," he said. She accepted this and looked around the lobby for her friends with the purpose and full energy of someone who had completed a task and was ready for the next one. Mrs. Patton appeared at Evan's elbow. "She was wonderful," she said, with the convictions of someone who had watched Sadie practice the arm thing in the kitchen approximately 15 times and had a genuine investment in the result. "She was," Evan said. He stood in the lobby of the Ridgefield Community Center on a Thursday evening, while around him 200 people navigated the cheerful obstacle course of a post-recital crowd, and he thought about a version of himself from 4 years ago who had been so completely focused on survival, the daily survival of grief, of transition, of making sure Sadie had what she needed, that the future had collapsed into a series of immediate requirements. Pick her up at 3. Make the lunch. Write the note with the crooked star. Get through today so tomorrow could happen. That was the right way to survive what he had survived. He didn't regret it. But survival was not the whole story. At some point he couldn't name the exact moment because it wasn't a moment, it was an accumulation. The question had shifted from how do I get through this to what do I actually do with what I have. The aviation knowledge, the years of experience, the particular way he understood problems that most people experienced as mysteries, the capacity to walk into an unfamiliar cockpit and feel what it was telling him through his hands and feet and the base of his spine. He'd been keeping all of that on a shelf because the shelf had seemed like the safe place for it. And at some point, the safe place had become the only place, which was a different thing entirely. Victoria had said it. You were keeping something on a shelf for 3 years and picked it up, and it fit exactly the same as before. She hadn't been wrong. She also hadn't been entirely right. It didn't fit exactly the same. He was 32 and not 28. He had Sadie, and he had the weight of everything that had happened, and he had learned things in 3 years of custodial work that he had not known how to learn in 11 years of aviation, the patience of someone invisible, the observation of someone overlooked, the particular freedom of existing in a space, without the armor of title or rank or institutional expectation. He'd been the janitor nobody noticed, and that had turned out to be its own kind of education. The person who had walked to that cockpit was not only the military pilot with 10,000 hours. He was also the man who had packed turkey sandwiches with Crooked Star notes at 4:30 in the morning and mopped lab corridors in the dark, and learned to be present in the spaces between the important things, which was, it turned out, where most of life actually lived. He was both. He had always been both. The world had just needed a particular moment to make that visible, and a particular person, difficult and driven and learning, imperfectly and genuinely, to see past the things she'd created of herself, to be standing in the right position to see it. Yo! Sadie appeared at his side, having located her friends, and exchanged the required post-performance debrief. "Can we get food?" she said. "What do you want?" he said. She thought about it, with the seriousness of someone making a decision that mattered. "Turkey," she said. "Okay," he said, "not turkey." She took his hand the way she hadn't done in public in about a year, since she'd decided she was too old for it, and then apparently had decided tonight was an exception. And he didn't say anything about it, because the right response to an exception was to accept it and not make it into anything. They walked out through the lobby and into the Thursday night, which was cool and clear. The sky doing its particular thing with stars that was neither poetic nor otherwise just the sky, being the sky, indifferent and enormous, and present in the way that permanent things were present. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. He didn't take it out. Whatever it was, it could wait. He walked across the parking lot with his daughter's hand in his, and the night was ordinary and the world was large, and the next thing was dinner, and that was enough. More than enough. It was the life he had built from what had broken, and what had held, and what had turned out, against several reasonable odds, to still be exactly what it needed to be. Perfect. Not the plan. Just real and his and continuing. And 3:01 every afternoon, give or take 2 minutes. The most important part of every day arrived in a backpack and dance miss bag combination at a school pickup line, and ran without looking at her feet, and the whole thing kept going, as it was always going to, as it was always going to keep on doing.